Chapter 1727. Gui Shou and the World Emperor discussed many things. It involved many aspects, and if they were to be described in detail, it would probably take hundreds of billions of words to explain. After leaving the World Emperor's cave dwelling, Gui Shou's actions began to change. He began to use the power of the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush to slightly adjust the great Tao of the entire underworld, as well as the laws of the entire underworld. He vaguely began to resonate with a certain existence in the Yang world. As they resonated with each other, the Yang world seemed to have suddenly obtained an inexplicable power. The changes that were originally a little stagnant suddenly began to accelerate. The countless fragments of the great Tao that had vaguely formed a long river in the void began to fuse faster and faster. The countless mysteries of the true saint were also constantly fusing into the fragments of the great Tao, gradually becoming a part of the fragments of the great Tao, gradually transforming into the true great Tao. At the same time, the inexplicable existence above began to become clearer and clearer. It was as if the distance between it and the heavens and earth was gradually narrowing. That kind of indescribable existence could not be described with specific words at all. It was even more impossible to use any form to describe its appearance and color. The only thing that could be described was inexplicable. However, this inexplicable existence seemed to be gradually being broken at this moment. It was in the form of a long river. It gradually appeared from the inexplicable existence and seemed to be thinking about the great Tao fragments. The long river formed by the true saint mysteries seemed to be closing in. This change was naturally extremely obvious to everyone in the Yang world. The many supreme emperors who were working hard to perfect this world were also sincerely happy about this. This situation meant that this world was rapidly moving towards perfection, quickly moving toward a level that could withstand the great calamity of this world. At the same time, the many supreme emperors also sensed it. The time for the great calamity of this world to descend was also constantly approaching, charging for millions of years. It turned into 9,990,000 years, and then 9,980,000 years. Just like that, it was like a countdown that was flashing rapidly. Unknowingly, it had happened. Amidst everyone's joy, they gradually felt an inexplicable pressure. Under this inexplicable pressure, many supreme emperors began to have all sorts of thoughts in their hearts, or rather, all sorts of selfish motives. In the process of perfecting the world, they borrowed the power of the world to build their own defenses. They either refined materials to refine magic treasures, or used the power of heaven and earth to construct various arrays, or directly combined into various space-time. Although they appear to be quite confident in the great tribulation of heaven and earth. However, none of them were fools. None of them really felt that they would not be in any danger in the great tribulation of the world. Under such circumstances, the great tribulation of heaven and earth was descending faster and faster. How could they not plan for themselves? This kind of behavior could not be hidden from anyone, but no one said anything about it. Because as long as it didn't affect the great cause of perfecting the world, they had no reason to care about such selfishness. Time passed slowly. In the blink of an eye, tens of thousands of years had passed. On this day, countless rays of light flickered between heaven and earth, and an indescribable heavenly sound gushed out from the void. It began to envelop the entire region and enter the ears of all living beings in the world. It made all living beings in the world feel indescribable joy from the bottom of their hearts. At this moment, the long river formed by countless fragments of the great Tao and the mysteries of the true sage hanging in the sky had truly condensed into one, turning into a terrifying great Tao that no living being had ever seen before. Even a knowledgeable Luo fan couldn't help but feel inexplicably shocked when he saw the great Tao take shape. This great Tao was many times more powerful than any great Tao he had ever seen. Even the great Tao of the Earth universe and the great Tao of the primordial world paled in comparison to this great Tao in front of him. In this great Tao, there were endless mysteries of the true sage. He could even vaguely see the shadows of the true sages flickering in the depths of the great Tao. As for the inexplicable existence that was originally hidden in the depths of the world and above the void, it had completely fused with the great Tao and became a part of it. This change caused the great Tao to appear in the sky. Any living being could see it with a glance and sense its existence. However, the moment they looked away, they would naturally forget about it. They would naturally think that there was nothing in the sky and that there was no shadow of the great Tao. At this moment, the rays of light that filled the world and the heavenly sound came from this great Tao. However, no one could remember that the great Tao above was the source of the heavenly sound after they looked away. To everyone, the heavenly sound seemed to have appeared out of thin air, and the rays of light also appeared out of thin air. Amidst the endless rays of light and heavenly sounds, strands of laws and laws swam out from the great path and began to rapidly spread to every inch of the void in the entire world. These nomological laws were dense and all-encompassing. Almost all the principles and mysteries of the universe were contained within them. Wherever they swam, the four basic existences, time, space, matter, and energy, seemed to suddenly have a source. They began to become more stable, more orderly, and more powerful. At the same time, the many living beings in this world also instantly felt as if a powerful existence had suddenly appeared. It began to suppress them, causing their originally unrestrained power to be inexplicably restricted. All the power seemed to have to follow some new rules to be able to be unleashed. At the same time, the originally scattered energy in their bodies began to undergo some sort of orderly transformation. The living beings that were originally formed from chaotic energy, which had the power of a pseudo-sage but did not have any intelligence at all, completely collapsed during this process. One by one, they were crushed by the countless nomological laws. In the end, all their power was integrated into the nomological laws and transformed into more and more denser nomological laws. This transformation process could even affect time. The time that they experienced naturally couldn't be determined with a specific time. In a trance, it seemed like billions of years had passed, but it also seemed like only an instant had passed. The entire world was already firmly enveloped by the nomological laws. A layer of nomological laws that had never appeared before began to appear in this world and gradually sank, finally sinking into the space-time layer. At the same time, the great Tao that had spread out countless nomological laws and completely enveloped the entire world. It also began to sink along with the nomological laws and laws. This kind of sinking wasn't to the ground, but to the depths of space-time. Therefore, in the senses of the living beings who could see and sense the great Tao seemed to be gradually distancing itself from them, becoming more and more illusory and illusory. In the end, when the nomological laws and laws were finally in place, the great Tao had unknowingly disappeared from the senses of all living beings. Hidden in the deepest part of the nomological laws and laws, in a strange place that had just been constructed in the unseen world, it's finally perfected. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the underworld, sighed slightly. He couldn't be more familiar with the structure of the great Tao, the unseen world, the nomological laws, and the space-time layer. Almost any stable space-time with a great Tao had such a structure. Only before this world was perfected would it be in a state where there was no distinction at all and everything was completely mixed together. It's a pity. If they could seize the previous opportunity, perhaps there wouldn't be so many false sages in this world now. At this moment, the World Emperor's figure appeared in front of Luo Fan and sighed slightly. After experiencing the changes over the long years, the number of false sages in this world had unknowingly increased to tens of billions of them. At this moment, so many false sages had already built hundreds of billions of space-time all over the world. Each of them was hidden within, cultivating, comprehending the changes of this world, or directly participating in the changes of this world to help the many supreme emperors perfect this world. However, All of these were actually ordinary living beings in the world who were constantly getting closer to the Grand Tao and gradually communicating with it as the world was being perfected. They obtained all sorts of comprehensions from it and stimulated their own intelligence. These living beings had the power of a false sage. It was precisely because they lacked the intelligence of a false sage that they couldn't become true false sages. And as the unknown place continued to get closer to the long river of the Great Tao, the difficulty of coming into contact with it was extremely reduced. This allowed them to unknowingly have the opportunity to come into contact with the unknown place. In the process, they were unknowingly guided by the unknown place, giving birth to intelligence from the power and obtaining intelligence that was compatible with the power. This allowed them to become true false sages. This was also why there were actually billions of false saints in this world. Of course, there were many living beings who could seize the opportunity to become false saints, but there were also many living beings who couldn't. When the rules and laws layer was established, they couldn't withstand the order set by the rules and laws layer and were directly destroyed by the power in their bodies, causing all the fragments of the Great Tao and all the mysteries of the true saint to be converted into rules and laws. In the end, they merged into the rules and laws layer, causing the rules and laws layer to become tighter and stronger. This completely different fate was enough to make people sigh. You really are greedy, fellow Taoist. With these tens of billions of false saints, the chance of passing through the great tribulation of the world this time had become extremely easy. Perhaps even the heavens and earth wouldn't be able to bear it. Luo Fan said lightly. It's a pity. That's trillions of lives. Even if there's only 1 in 100 million, it's still countless times more than what we have now. The World King sighed. Although the Realm Emperor was not a creature born and bred in this world, he was still a Realm Emperor. However, the time he had existed in this world had surpassed all the supreme emperors and the living beings that still existed in this world. All of the creatures that were destroyed were born in his eyes, and they evolved and grew under his senses. Towards those living beings, he naturally had a feeling as if he was looking at his own creation. If he could decide, he even hoped that all the living beings could survive. All living beings could become false saints after this world was perfected. Therefore, to him, no matter how many living beings perished, he would always feel a sense of unwillingness. So what if they can all become false saints? In this great tribulation of the world, these false saints are the first to bear the brunt. How many of them can survive? Luo Fan sighed slightly. The Realm King could only sigh helplessly at this moment. Although these living beings had already become false saints and had endless power in this world, if there were no accidents, they would definitely be able to live as long as the world and shine as the sun and moon. However, the price they had to pay was to completely fuse with this world. As a result, when the great tribulation of the world descended, they would be like a turtle. The first to bear the power of the great tribulation of the world would be forced by this world to be the first to resist the great tribulation of the world. And this was for those who had the book of life and death and the judge's brush. For the turtle that had already become an alternative level 3 emperor, although it was dangerous, it was still within its range of tolerance. However, to these pseudo-saints, it was almost fatal. At this moment, Luo Fan could even see it. When the great tribulation of the world descended, these billions of false saints would fall like dumplings. I've decided. I'll preach the Tao to these false saints, the World King said after a while. Preach the Tao? Do you still have time? Luo Fan said calmly. This world had already been perfected to such an extent that it could even be considered flawless. The time for the great tribulation of the world to descend was naturally extremely close. According to the current calculations, in less than 100,000 years, the great tribulation of the world would descend. 100,000 years. Although it's a little short, it's better than doing nothing. The World King sighed. In that case, count me in when the time comes. Luo Fan thought for a while and sighed. Preaching the Tao was not a problem for him. Although it would not bring him much benefits, he would not lose anything either. However, if he preached the Tao to these billions of false saints, It could greatly increase the probability of these false saints surviving. Perhaps it could turn the tragic fate of a few false saints surviving into a few hundred. Hearing Luo Fan's words, the World King bowed to Luo Fan and said, "Thank you, fellow Taoist." "You're welcome." Luo Fan merely smiled. "Originally, I planned to do it alone. Since fellow Taoist is willing to help, why don't we invite other fellow Taoists to do it together? This way, we can communicate with each other and obtain one last chance to improve before the great tribulation of the world," the World King suggested. "That's great," Luo Fan said with a smile. The World King smiled slightly. With a thought, waves of fluctuations emanated from his body. Not long after, he said to Luo Fan, "Since everyone has agreed, I'll go and prepare now. I hope that fellow Taoist will come when the time comes." Luo Fan smiled faintly. Immediately, the World King's figure gradually disappeared in front of him. As he disappeared, an inexplicable ripple spread out from the Yang realm and spread across the entire world. No matter where the false saints were hidden, they could instantly sense this ripple. They all understood that a great fortuitous encounter was about to appear for them. At the same time, in the civilized country that had already spread throughout the entire world and even existed in the underworld, countless living beings also received this fluctuation. This civilized country had now become the true protagonist of the world. Although the number of false saints, and it was not as many as the tens of billions of false saints that other living beings had achieved due to the perfection of the world, there were still millions of them. These false saints were the false saints of the civilized country, the distance between them and the world. However, they were a level higher than the false saints that ordinary living beings had achieved. Their power was limited to the range of the civilized country, and they were not as dangerous as the tens of billions of false saints. However, after all, they were also an important force for this world to survive the great calamity of the world. The World King naturally could not give up on them. They naturally had a share in the Tao lecture this time. At this moment, various thoughts shot out continuously in this world. The surface of the entire world seemed to be no different from before. However, from the perspective of the powerhouses, it had already become extremely lively. It could even be considered chaotic. Naturally, no false saint would be willing to let go of this opportunity of having so many supreme emperors preach the Tao. At this moment, immediately, countless rays of light burst out from all over the world and began to rapidly shoot towards the space-time that the World King had opened up. Now that the world was perfect, the laws and principles were extremely strict. It was no longer as simple as before to open up a space-time. However, similarly, the space-time that was opened up was no longer as chaotic and fragile as before. Under the protection of the laws and principles, as long as a space-time could be opened up, it would naturally be protected by the laws and principles. As long as it did not suffer too much damage, it would definitely exist forever and would not be damaged at all. As for a supreme level 3 emperor like the World King, he would naturally not be affected too much by the laws and principles. The difficulty of opening up a space-time was not much different from before. In comparison, the perfection of this world was only beneficial to the space-time that he had opened up. This space-time that was opened up was extremely vast and mysterious. Within it, the laws and principles, the great Tao, the mysteries of the true saint. It existed in the state before this world was perfected. All the fragments were mixed together. If one looked at it from a normal perspective, everything would be gray and hazy. One could not see through anything or any scenery at all. However, one had to use the perspective change that Luo Fan had when he first entered this world in order to see a vast and boundless world and endless natural scenery. Any false saint who entered this space-time would naturally feel an inexplicable sense of nostalgia. Although this kind of scene was not something that a perfect space-time should have. After all, that was a scene that they had seen for billions of years. It had long been deeply engraved in their life origin and had become a part of their lives. To them, the sudden loss was obviously not a small one. Now that the world had completely changed, being able to see such a scene in reality again was obviously something to be happy about. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone, who was in the underworld Earth, thought to himself, "He's quite fast." After the thought flashed through his mind, his heart moved. He lifted his foot and took a step forward, leaving the underworld. The current underworld didn't seem to be much different from before. There were still countless space-times dotted in the pitch-black void, like the stars in the universe. However, compared to back then, the netherworld Earth had changed quite a bit. Among them, the biggest change was the Great Tao of the underworld. Compared to before, the Great Tao had become even more profound and vast. In the Great Tao, there was also that inexplicable place integrated into it. It also had that inexplicable place's characteristics and mysteries. As for the mysteries of the true saint, it had increased to the same level as the Great Tao of the Yang world. This was clearly the completion of the Yang world, and it had also affected the underworld. Unknowingly, it had changed the Great Tao of the underworld, allowing the Great Tao of the underworld and the Great Tao of the Yang world to grow at the same time. The Yang world and the underworld were actually one, two in one. At this moment, if one's perspective was changed, one would be able to see that the Great Tao of the underworld and the Great Tao of the Yang world were connected in an unknown depth. As for the other laws, the layer of laws, space-time, and so on, they were also connected in a similar structure. It was because of this that the world monarch was able to enter the underworld so easily. When Luo Fan left the underworld, he did not need to touch the Great Tao of the underworld like before. Instead, he directly entered the Yang world as if he had stepped out of his home. After entering the Yang world, Luo Fan did not directly appear in the space-time created by the world monarch. Instead, he randomly appeared in a mountain range in the Yang world. Compared to the past, everything in the Yang realm had undergone tremendous changes. Chapter 1728. In the past, this mountain range was filled with a barbaric aura. Even an existence like Luo Fan could feel the displeasure in this place. If ordinary beings dared to come here, they would definitely be seeking death. If they didn't have the determination to pay with their lives, they definitely wouldn't dare to set foot here. However, it was completely different now. At this moment, this mountain range gave off a feeling like it was a fairyland. Although it was still not absolutely safe, it gave Luo Fan an extremely comfortable feeling. The various energies that filled this mountain range were no longer that kind of aura, but various kinds of heaven and earth chi. They were all kinds of energies with different natures. The creatures that lived in various parts of this mountain range were newly born in this world. They were the creatures that were born according to the laws of this world that had just been perfected among them. One could even find all kinds of benevolent divine beasts and immortal beasts that wholeheartedly pursued the Tao. Although it was not peaceful everywhere, it was already a world of difference compared to the past. Luo Fan set foot on a peak in this mountain range. With a thought, he sensed everything in this mountain range clearly, although this was only a small corner of this world. However, from the changes that occurred here, he could roughly understand how many unimaginable changes had taken place in this world. If this world continues to develop like this, in less than 100 million years, this world will definitely completely transform into a perfect world similar to the Earth's universe. Perhaps it will even be more magnificent and mysterious than the Earth's universe. Even more mysterious? Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Unfortunately, this world did not have 100 million years left. After 100,000 years, this world would welcome its first great tribulation of heaven and earth. Moreover, it would be a great tribulation of heaven and earth that was many times more powerful than the first great tribulation of heaven and earth of other normal perfect worlds. At that time, even if this world could survive, it would definitely be seriously damaged. At that time, it would not be so easy for it to recover to its current state. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan lifted his foot and took a light step forward. His figure had already crossed this mountain range. They arrived at a nearby city. If there was one type of creature that would benefit the most from the perfection of the world, it would definitely be the creatures with born Taoism aptitudes among the many civilized countries. Those with born Taoism aptitude were the true protagonists of this world. This could already be seen when the world reacted. However, even though they were the protagonists of the world, the many living beings with born Taoism aptitudes were extremely weak when they were born. This was something that could not be changed. Even if these creatures cultivated to the highest level, they were definitely not the strongest in this world. This was especially so when the world was not perfect before that. The great Tao was still in fragments, and the true divine mysteries were still incompatible with the great Tao fragments. In such a state of the world, creatures with born Taoism aptitudes were practically at the bottom of the food chain, if not for his identity as the true protagonist of the world. They had probably been completely crushed and devoured by the countless creatures that were at the false sage level. How could it become as powerful as it was now? After the world was perfected, this situation was different. Heaven and earth are perfected. The biggest characteristic was that extremely weak and powerless creatures began to be born in this world. The birth of weak creatures required order. The tighter the order of the world, the weaker the living beings could be. This wasn't hard to understand, just like this world. Previously, when the world was in a state where countless fragments of the great Tao and countless mysteries of the true saint were mixed together, the pressure on everything that existed in it must have been extremely strong. If a living being was too weak, just appearing in this kind of illusory realm would be enough to kill it. He would be completely crushed by the mixture of countless fragments of the great way and the true divine mysteries. How could he survive? Only now did this world possess an extremely perfect order, and all the powers within it had to operate according to that order. It could not erupt or be destroyed at will. Only then could those weak living beings avoid being crushed by those powers under the protection of order. Only then could they survive in this world. Therefore, when the world had become like this and possessed such an extremely tight and powerful rule, living beings with extremely weak bodies and little power could be born in this world. This way, for the living beings with born Taoism aptitude in this civilized country, the benefits were great. One could imagine, in the past, they needed to cultivate extremely powerful strength to be able to leave the protection of the civilized country and leave the range of the civilized country to explore. Even so, they had to leave their lives in the hands of the world. If they accidentally entered the territory of an ordinary living being, they would lose their lives and be annihilated. However, it was different now. The order of the world was so tight, and the rules were so complicated. No power could escape the control of these rules. As long as the living beings with born Taoism aptitude followed the order, they could leave the civilized country even if they had no power. Moreover, after leaving, they could walk with more confidence. They did not need to worry about any ordinary living beings. They only needed to worry about those living beings that were stronger than them. This had obviously greatly expanded the range of activity of the living beings with born Taoism aptitude, and it had also greatly increased their chances of survival. For the living beings with born Taoism aptitude, they now truly received treatment that was compatible with the protagonists of this world. As Luo Fan walked casually, the various changes that occurred in the civilized country due to the changes in the world slowly flashed through his mind. Currently, the vast and boundless civilized country had already fallen into a state of fanaticism. It was a fanaticism of expanding outward. This fanaticism, it filled the faces of all living beings in the civilized country with hope. All of them were looking forward to the wonderful life they would have in the future. It was as if they had suddenly been thrown into heaven from hell. The first thing they saw was endless treasures. Luo Fan was now a level 3 emperor. He was so powerful that he had almost reached the limit of what the world could accommodate. As he walked in the civilized country, not only was his speed extremely shocking, but it also exceeded the range that all living beings and experts could sense. As he walked, he left one city after another behind him. In just 10 minutes, he had already crossed a distance of hundreds of millions of light years and directly arrived in front of the space-time that the Realm Emperor had opened up. This space-time looked like a small mountain from the outside. At the foot of the mountain, there was a small door. Through this door, one could directly step into the strange space-time inside. Luo Fan did not hesitate, nor did he choose any special method. Instead, he directly followed the Realm Emperor's settings and walked through the door. As the space-time distorted, his figure had already penetrated through the layers of space-time and arrived in that space-time. He saw the extremely familiar gray world. With a thought, his perspective changed slightly, and a boundless world appeared before his eyes. Fellow Taoist, you're really in a good mood. Luo Fan sighed and lifted his foot lightly. His figure had already arrived at the highest point of this space-time. Here, the Realm Emperor was quietly sitting cross-legged on a cloud bed. Hearing Luo Fan's words, the Realm Emperor just smiled and said, I've seen this scene for billions of trillions of years. Now that it has suddenly disappeared, it's quite nostalgic. Luo Fan smiled and said, perhaps. However, I'm not used to this kind of scene. In comparison, I'm more familiar with the scene of the outside world now. As he spoke, a cloud bed appeared under him, and he also sat cross-legged on it. I see. However, I think as the host, I still have some privileges, right? The Realm Emperor said with a smile. Luo Fan naturally knew what he meant. Obviously, he was not willing to change the appearance of this space-time for Luo Fan. However, he did not care. He just smiled and said, of course. Although I'm more used to the appearance of the outside space-time, I don't feel any discomfort in front of me. At this moment, within the distortion of space-time, supreme sovereigns that Luo Fan was familiar with and unfamiliar with continuously appeared in this space-time. In fact, they were already prepared. If they wanted to, they could have already arrived before Luo Fan arrived. However, although there were no written rules, they still followed the rules of the strong and the weak. Preaching was not as important as other things. The order of the preacher's arrival represented their cultivation, strength, and status. Since they already knew that Luo Fan would also participate in this preaching, they did not dare to arrive before Luo Fan. Perhaps Luo Fan would not care if they arrived first, but they were still worried that Luo Fan would arrive first. That was why there was such a situation. Luo Fan had already arrived slowly and had been delayed for such a long time, but he was still the second to arrive. It was not until he arrived that the other supreme sovereigns arrived one by one. After these supreme sovereigns arrived in this space-time, they also directly appeared at the highest point of this void. One by one, they bowed to the World Emperor and Luo Fan. Then, according to the strength of their strength and realm, they built cloud beds and distributed them under the seats of Luo Fan and the World Emperor. Almost all the supreme sovereigns had already agreed to come. In the end, nearly 300 supreme sovereigns appeared in this area together. The 300 cloud beds were arranged separately, and rays of light emitted from these cloud beds. They directly shrouded the entire area of this space-time, causing all the false saints in this space-time to instantly feel an indescribable comfort. When this change occurred, the pseudo-saints that numbered in the billions also discovered that there was an existence that was countless times stronger than them at the top of the void. Immediately, the many false saints bowed to the highest point in the void and thanked the exalted Lord. At this moment, the first to speak was the World Emperor. He did not say much nonsense. He opened his mouth and waves of great Tao sounds continuously surged out. These sounds of the great Tao were so mysterious. After they were spoken, it was as if they had directly evolved into mysterious great Tao sounds that fell straight down. In a trance, they had already appeared in front of all the false saints in this world. They were heard and seen by all the false saints. It also surged into the hearts of all the false saints, allowing them to feel the endless mysteries contained in the great Tao sounds. The World Emperor's voice did not stop, and the great Tao sounds surged out continuously. Waves of great Tao sounds continued to descend and fall into the space-time below. Gradually, the world seemed to be enveloped by endless great Tao sounds. At this moment, there was no longer any noise in the vast and boundless space-time. All the pseudo-saints were intoxicated. They were completely immersed in the endless sound of the great Tao, carefully comprehending the endless principles contained in it. Every great Tao sound, it was as if a brand new door had been opened in front of these pseudo-sages, allowing them to comprehend endless mysteries that they had vaguely sensed previously but could not see clearly or comprehend completely. At the same time, at the highest point, Luo Fan and the others, who were sitting on the cloud bed, were also listening to the great Tao sounds. They were also carefully sensing the endless mysteries contained in these great Tao sounds. However, compared to those false saints, they would not be so immersed in it. They would not be completely attracted by the great Tao sounds, nor would they be completely immersed in it. Although these great Tao sounds were endless, their level was only at the false saint level after all. This was obviously nothing to any supreme emperor. Although what they heard from the voice of the great Tao was not necessarily much different from what they had comprehended themselves, and there were still many things that could move them, it was still incomparable to what they had comprehended themselves. Under such circumstances, many supreme emperors unknowingly had all kinds of impulses because of these great Tao sounds, all kinds of impulses to talk about their own great Tao. The first to speak was, of course, Luo Fan, who was second only to the World Emperor. Amidst the endless great Tao sounds emitted by the World Emperor, Luo Fan also opened his mouth, and the great Tao sounds surged out. These great Tao sounds also turned into great Tao sounds that reverberated in the entire space-time, continuously entering the senses of the many false saints. This great Tao sound was different from the World Emperor's great Tao sound, but there were also similarities. Although they were only false sage-level mysteries, they were extremely profound and unfathomable to the false saints who numbered in the tens of billions. An indescribable joy surged in the hearts of every false saint. At that time, they felt the joy of hearing the Tao in the morning. As Luo Fan spoke, the other supreme emperors also spoke one after another. Waves of great Tao sounds began to pour down from the highest point of the void like rain, covering the sky and earth as they pounced towards the many false saints below. Feeling the endless great Tao sounds, the many false saints seemed to have fallen into a gluttonous feast. Their bodies and minds were filled with the endless mysteries. The countless sounds of the great Tao were different from each other, but they all contained the most profound principles and profundities of the false saint level. Every time they comprehended a little, the false saints would feel that their strength had increased a little. Every time they improved a little, they would feel that their understanding of the false saints had deepened a little. Waves of mysterious aura began to emit from the bodies of these false saints, gradually filling the space-time and the world, causing the space-time and the world to gradually turn into a dreamlike scene. Even the boundaries of time and space seemed to have been confused in the eyes of the outside world. The mountain peak where this space-time was located seemed to have become the second sun of this world, starting to emit a mysterious light. This light was so intense and so mysterious. Under the shroud of this light, the world seemed to have been broken. The underworld, the Yang realm, the law layer, the great Tao, everything seemed to have been linked together and directly appeared above this mountain. At this moment, countless cultivators with powerful eyesight couldn't help but look at this mountain peak from all directions. Although this world was unimaginably vast, even describing it as 1,000,000,000,000 light years, it needed to be multiplied by a few 100,000,000 to completely encompass the entire world. However, no matter where it was, no matter how far away the living beings were from this mountain peak, they could see this mountain peak at a glance. They could see the light emitted by this mountain peak, and they could see the underworld, the Yang realm, the law layer, the great Tao, and everything else that was connected above the mountain peak. In a trance, it was as if all of this was happening directly in their hearts. It was as if it was happening in their hearts. Although the World Emperor, Luo Fan, and the others were preaching the Tao to the many false saints in that space-time, how mysterious and unfathomable was the Tao they were preaching. Even the space-time opened by the World Emperor couldn't completely restrict the Tao they were preaching. Those Tao penetrated the barrier of space-time and continuously spread out. This was why this ordinary mountain peak had unknowingly become like this, allowing countless living beings to directly penetrate space-time and see these phenomena. Of course, they were already separated by a layer of space-time. Even if they saw these phenomena, even if they could feel the endless mysteries, it was impossible for them to directly receive all the mysteries and principles during this process. To them, they could only vaguely sense some of the mysteries that they could understand. Perhaps they could obtain some comprehension that would be helpful to their cultivation realm, but it was impossible for them to use this mystery to become a false saint or a higher level. Time flew by, and in a trance, 10,000 years had passed. And in these 10,000 years, in that space-time, time and space had already been mixed up by the countless sounds of the great Tao. It was unknown how many billions of years had passed. Or rather, it couldn't be said that so many years had passed. Instead, in the senses of all living beings, it was as if so many years had passed. After these long years of preaching, at this moment, among the 10 billion false saints. However, nearly 10% of them had broken through their current realm from the original false saint level to the desperation level. Of course, they had only reached the desperation level. In fact, they themselves were not like Luo Fan back then. Only by sensing the origin of the realm would they step into the desperation level. It was just an increase in strength and realm reaching that level. 10% of 10 billion was 1 billion. If 10% of the 10 billion false saints stepped into the desperation level, it meant that a total of 1 billion desperation were born. This number, compared to the situation on Earth back in the universe, was really a world of difference. This thought occasionally flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he felt as if it was a lifetime ago. Over the long years, many supreme emperors had used the sounds of the great Tao to show each other their understanding of the false saint level. Unknowingly, the victor had already been decided. Among the close to 300 supreme emperors, only 10 or so supreme emperors stood out. Among them were Luo Fan and the World Emperor. Among them, Luo Fan and the World Emperor surpassed the others and stood at the highest peak. In terms of their understanding of the false saint level, they crushed everyone else. As for who won in terms of their understanding of the false saint level, it wasn't decided yet. Luo Fan was strong because he understood the key to becoming a true saint and saw the true path to becoming a true saint. Using such a higher level of vision to comprehend the various aspects of the false saint level was naturally a strategically advantageous one. He was able to analyze and deduce the various details of the false saint level from a perspective that surpassed other supreme emperors. Naturally, he was much stronger than other supreme emperors. Although the World Emperor did not have a strategically advantageous position like Luo Fan, he had, after all, cultivated for a longer period of time than any other supreme emperor. In fact, among the 7 true sages, 6 of them had cultivated for less time than him. Such an existence had a wide range of knowledge and a deep understanding of cultivation. Was there a need to doubt him? Using this kind of knowledge to understand the various mysteries of the false saint level was naturally not something that other supreme emperors could compare to. It was natural for him to be able to compete with Luo Fan in this aspect. Chapter 1729. For the many supreme emperors, the 2 of them standing out was within their expectations. In fact, it was also because of their standing out that the many supreme emperors felt glad that they had placed Luo Fan's position second only to the World Emperor back then. The supreme emperors gradually stopped their voices of the great Tao, and the entire space-time fell into silence. Go! The World Emperor sighed slightly and said. Following this, an inexplicable repulsive force acted on all the false saints and desperators, causing their figures to be expelled out of this space-time in the blink of an eye. One by one, they appeared around the mountain outside the space-time. The strength of each of the 10 billion false saints was enough to shock the world. Even though the vast world outside was so vast, the strength of these false saints couldn't be ignored. Even if the 10 billion false saints gathered together, even if they didn't specifically release their aura to shock the world, The essence of their existence naturally caused an inexplicable distortion in the world, causing the law layer to show signs of changing. These false saints and desperators all bowed to Shirkong at this moment, their faces filled with gratitude and respect. After listening to the sermon for such a long time, the benefits they had obtained were beyond their imagination. How could they not be grateful in the face of such a harvest? After expressing their gratitude, these false saints and desperators dispersed. Although they had listened to the sermon for a long time at the same time, however, the number of false saints and desperators was simply too many. This made it so that they didn't have the chance to interact with each other. At this moment, they didn't stay behind to make friends and return to their cave abodes. Although listening to the sermon, 10% of the false saints had already broken through and became desperators. However, in fact, listening to the sermon was just listening to the sermon. They still needed a lot of time to absorb the gains from listening to the sermon and a lot of energy to transform the various gains before they could turn them into their own cultivation realm. Therefore, at this moment, what these false saints and desperators needed the most was to cultivate in seclusion, based on their aptitude, although it was impossible for all of them to become desperators. However, it was definitely not a problem for another 10% to 20% of the false saints to become desperators through absorbing the gains from listening to the sermon. In fact, it was precisely because he knew this. That was why the Realm Emperor did not keep them in that space-time. After listening to the Tao, he directly expelled them and let them return to their cave abodes to cultivate. Their choices were seen by the World Emperor and the others in the space-time. The World Emperor sighed. Although there are so many people in despair, the number of false sages left is still worrying. Luo Fan only smiled faintly when he heard this. If they hadn't been promoted to despair, their chances of survival would have been even lower. It's already not bad. Although I know this, I still can't bear it. The World Emperor sighed again. Fellow Taoist, there's no need to be so heartless. We've already done all that we can, and we've already done all that we can. If they can't seize this opportunity, they won't be able to truly advance. This is their own business, Luo Fan said. At this time, another Supreme Sovereign said, I'm rather envious of their opportunities. These words, all the Supreme Sovereigns focused their gazes on him. The Supreme Sovereign continued, how many billions of trillion years did we spend to break through to the false saint level back then? Yet, they've already completed such a breakthrough in just 10,000 years. This speed is really enviable. Hearing this, many Supreme Sovereigns had sorrowful expressions on their faces. It wasn't just that Supreme Sovereign who took so long to break through to the false saint level. Almost every Supreme Sovereign did the same. Everyone chatted casually for a while before dispersing. Although their goal this time was to preach the Tao to the 10 billion false saints, the process of preaching was also a process of communicating with each other. Although they were only talking about the mysteries of the false saint level, this was already enough to reflect the Tao that every Supreme Sovereign cultivated. It was enough to touch the hearts of the Supreme Sovereigns. At this moment, every Supreme Sovereign seemed to have comprehended something, but they had to go back and absorb it properly. In the end, only Luo Fan and the World Emperor were left here. After everyone left, Luo Fan said to the World Emperor, I wonder if you've deduced how the great tribulation of heaven and earth will erupt? The World Emperor shook his head and sighed. I can't deduce anything at all. I only know that the great tribulation of heaven and earth will be extremely terrifying. Even Supreme Sovereigns might die under this tribulation if they're not careful. Hearing this, Luo Fan sighed and said, You can't deduce anything, but I've deduced some traces. The World Emperor's expression changed, and his eyes lit up. I wonder what the result of your deduction is. However, he didn't doubt that Luo Fan wouldn't speak carelessly. At this level, they were extremely clear about each other's strength and methods. It was impossible for them to not know who was lying and who was telling the truth. Under such circumstances, who would choose to speak carelessly and brag? When Luo Fan heard this, he furrowed his brows, and there was a hint of confusion in his eyes. Compared to all the Supreme Sovereigns in the world, Luo Fan had his own advantage. He had seen the great tribulation of heaven and earth more than the other supreme sovereigns. He had even personally led the great tribulation of heaven and earth through several times. Because of this, Luo Fan's current familiarity with the great tribulation of heaven and earth was incomparable to the other supreme sovereigns. Because of his familiarity with the great tribulation of heaven and earth, he was able to deduce things from the various sensations he received before the great tribulation of heaven and earth. Naturally, he was much more knowledgeable than the other supreme sovereigns. Therefore, during the 10,000 years of preaching, Luo Fan received more and more information. He could vaguely sense the aura of the great tribulation of heaven and earth, and he could roughly guess how the great tribulation of heaven and earth would erupt. As for what he sensed, Luo Fan didn't hesitate much and told him everything. As the Realm King listened to Luo Fan's narration, his face alternated between green and white, and the depths of his eyes revealed a more and more serious color. Although he expected the great tribulation of heaven and earth to be extremely terrifying, he didn't expect the great tribulation of heaven and earth to be so terrifying. How could it be so horrifying? Thank you for telling me about this, fellow Taoist. Otherwise, I would have made an irreparable mistake. The Realm King bowed to Luo Fan and thanked him. Hearing this, Luo Fan shook his head and said, "Helping the world through the great tribulation of heaven and earth is also my responsibility. I'm also responsible for this. I can sense more things, so it is only natural for me to tell you. However, what do you plan to deal with this?" Originally, I planned to activate the previous arrangements and use the world to build a powerful formation to protect the world and endure the invasion of the great calamity of the world. But now, it seems that I can't use that method anymore. The World King frowned. Luo Fan wasn't surprised to hear this. As for the Realm King's arrangements, he was vaguely aware of it. Back then, when the various tasks of transforming the world were distributed, the Realm King had already invisibly spread the formation to every region of the world, connecting the entire world together. The many arrangements that formed the huge formation were handed over to the other supreme emperors. Now that the transformation of the world was completed, the formation was naturally completed at the same time. It could be said that for the formation to work, it only needed the World King to activate it at the right time. Then, do you have any new arrangements now? Luo Fan asked curiously, since the great tribulation of heaven and earth will appear in such a situation, using the formation as a passive defense. Naturally, it's impossible. My plan is to take the initiative and directly attack the source of the tribulation, the Realm King said. Hearing this, Luo Fan's eyes showed a look of realization. He smiled and said, "Then I'll wait and see." As he spoke, he stood up and gestured to the Realm King. Then, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. His figure had already crossed the world. With another stride, he had already triggered the strict rules and laws and directly arrived at the hall where his main body was, or rather, the space-time. Although the world outside had experienced such a huge change, everything inside the space-time was still the same as before. It was as if time had completely frozen here. At this moment, Luo Fan's main body and the other clone were already inside the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light. When the clone arrived, Luo Fan's main body took a step forward and left the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light. He came directly in front of the clone. Compared to before, after such a long period of cultivation, Luo Fan's main body had changed a lot. The eternal and inextinguishable aura on his body was several times stronger than before. The deep wisdom contained in his eyes was even more profound than before. After arriving here, Luo Fan's main body didn't move at all, but the clone had already directly integrated into his body. Then, an inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. Taking the initiative, I like it. As he spoke, he raised his hand and gently pointed. In an instant, the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light that was like a long river rotated slightly and turned into a halo that directly floated behind his head. As it expanded and contracted slightly, it seemed like some kind of divine ability that he had cultivated, or like the merit that he had obtained in a certain world in the past. The moment the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light changed, the space-time began to tremble slightly. The originally vast space-time began to slowly shrink and condense slightly. In the end, it shrank to 1/10 of its original size. The degree of condensing had also reached nearly 10 times the original level before it stopped. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan's heart moved. He already knew the reason why the space-time before was so vast and mysterious. It was because of the power of the inextinguishable spiritual light that had compressed and enriched it. Now that the power of the inextinguishable spiritual light had been restrained and contracted, it naturally returned to its original state. After turning the inextinguishable spiritual light into a halo that floated behind his head, Luo Fan took a step forward, and his figure was already out of the space-time. Then he took a step forward. His figure moved towards where the Gate of Chaos was located. The perfection of this world was all-encompassing. The regions involved covered every single corner of the world. Even the Primal Chaos Gate was no exception. At this moment, the Gate of Chaos was no longer as vast and boundless as it was before. It looked like a boundless state of chaos. At this moment, the Chaos Gate looked like a mass of gray mist. The size of this cloud was extremely strange. It seemed to be extremely big, but also seemed to be extremely small. It seemed to be boundless and vast, but also seemed to be so narrow that one couldn't drill into it. As expected, it's still here, looking at the Gate of Chaos. A faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. The Gate of Chaos was formed due to some special reason in this world. This caused the state of chaos to affect everything within a certain range of this world, causing it to transform into a state of chaos. During the process of the Supreme Emperor's perfecting this world, the hole between heaven and earth and the state of chaos couldn't be completely mended and eliminated because of their level. However, the hole was still greatly reduced due to their means. It was also because of this reason that caused such a change to the Gate of Chaos. When Luo Fan arrived, he raised his hand and gently pointed. In an instant, a three-legged round cauldron rushed out from his universe in his sleeve and instantly appeared above the Gate of Chaos. In this three-legged round cauldron was the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure that Luo Fan had painstakingly refined. This three-legged round cauldron was currently only at the level of a desperate one. Compared to Luo Fan at this moment, it was insignificant. It wasn't worth mentioning. Ever since Luo Fan became a Supreme Emperor, he hadn't used this pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure in the past tens of millions of years. This was proof of this. Under normal circumstances, Luo Fan had the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light, so he wouldn't need this pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure. However, this time situation was too special. He had no choice but to take out the Divine Court Heaven Cauldron and use it again. However, this Divine Court Heaven Cauldron's level was too low. If he couldn't strengthen it as much as possible, it wouldn't have much effect even if he took it out when the time came. This was why Luo Fan was doing this. After sending out the Divine Court Heaven Cauldron, Luo Fan's heart moved. The Divine Court Heaven Cauldron turned slightly and pointed its mouth at the Gate of Chaos. Immediately after, an inexplicable suction was produced from the Divine Court Heaven Cauldron and directly acted on the Gate of Chaos. It began to pull the Gate of Chaos towards the Divine Court Heaven Cauldron. Although the Divine Court Heaven Cauldron's level wasn't high, under the control of Luo Fan, who was a level 3 emperor, the power it could exert was far beyond the level of a desperate one. When this suction acted on the gray Gate of Chaos, the Gate of Chaos began to tremble slightly. Its original spherical form was gradually distorted and broken during this process. Wisps of grayish existence began to separate from a sphere. Like rivers flowing into the sea, they quickly gathered in the heavenly cauldron of the Divine Court. From afar, it looked as if there were countless filaments growing from the Divine Court Heaven Cauldron and spreading to the huge sphere. At this moment, Luo Fan seemed to be struggling. Given his strength, he shouldn't be like this. Although the Gate of Chaos was powerful, it was still an inanimate object. If he wanted to, he could directly activate the power of the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light and crush it at will. The reason why he seemed to be struggling was because the level of the Divine Court Heaven Cauldron was too low. Because the level of the Divine Court Heaven Cauldron was too low, Luo Fan had no choice but to exert the power of the Divine Court Heaven Cauldron to absorb the Gate of Chaos. At the same time, he had to use even more mental strength to protect the Divine Court Heaven Cauldron so that it wouldn't collapse because of his carelessness. It was as if he was fighting himself with all his strength. It would be strange if he didn't feel strained. The gray existence that entered the Divine Court Heaven Cauldron was continuously destroyed by the Divine Court Heaven Cauldron and quickly integrated into its material. This caused the Divine Court Heaven Cauldron itself to become heavier and heavier. The quality of its material improved at a speed that was almost visible to the naked eye. The aura it emitted was also continuously strengthening. Along with this change, the power that the Divine Court Heaven Cauldron could exert naturally increased. The increase in power caused more and more gray existences to be absorbed by the Chaos Gate. At first, it was only a few strands, but after a few days, it had already turned into a long river, like 100 rivers flowing into the sea. It went straight into the three-legged round cauldron. With this change, Luo Fan's expression became strained. It also gradually weakened. The Heavenly Cauldron's power had become stronger, which meant that he didn't need to use too much power to defend against it. That sphere was formed from the world affected by the state of chaos. It contained the endless mysteries of space and time. He wanted to extract it completely. Obviously, it was impossible to measure the amount of time it would take to empty it based on its size. Therefore, although it seemed like a large amount of grayish existence was constantly being extracted and integrated into the heavenly cauldron of the Divine Hall, the sphere only shrunk to half its original size after 100 years. For an existence like Luo Fan, 100 years was a very short period of time. Obviously, it wasn't a very long time. However, in the past 100 years, the situation in this part of the world had changed. There were quite a few changes. First of all, the World Emperor, who had never left his cave abode, began to leave the cave abode and walk around. He seemed to be searching for something, but he also seemed to be simply taking a last look at what this perfect world looked like in its intact state. Secondly, there were more than 9 billion false saints. Apart from the 10% who had already become desperate, the remaining 9 billion were naturally among them. One after another, false saints broke through and stepped into the level of despair. This caused inexplicable rays of light to soar into the sky from time to time, enveloping the world, causing all living beings in this world to feel an inexplicable joy from the bottom of their hearts. Until now, although it had only been 100 years, hundreds of millions of false saints had already stepped into the level of despair. As more and more people in despair completed their cultivation, the world began to become lively. Those in despair who had completed their cultivation began to leave their cave abodes and walk around the world. They were either plotting for some kind of authority in this world or thinking of ways to strengthen their own sections. As for the protagonist of this world, the civilized country established by the living beings with the Khanate Tao Constitution was like a piece of cake that emitted endless deliciousness, attracting the attention of almost all the people in despair. In the past 100 years, the people in despair who had entered the civilized country through various means accounted for more than 80% of all the people in despair. Some of these people in despair directly challenged the false saints who had originally protected the civilized country and seized the responsibility of protecting it. Some directly established sects in this civilized country and began to spread their own cultivation path. Some simply wanted to control some areas, to seize resources, or fight with others of the same kind. As a result, the world seemed many times more complicated than it once was. It also made the cultivation civilization seem many times more prosperous than it once was. These various changes made the civilized country, which was the protagonist of this world, become more and more prosperous, and its power grew faster and faster. Although it had only been a short 100 years, the civilized country of the entire world had grown nearly 10 times. As for the number of false saints guarding it, it had increased from the original millions to the current hundreds of millions. As for the rules that completely belonged to the civilized country, as it was established within the range of the civilized country, it began to cover the rules of this world, forming an extremely mysterious structure. This unique rule made it seem like another world and another space-time within the range of the civilized country. Almost every small civilized country had its own characteristics and even had its own cultivation civilization. Some cultivation civilizations might even behave completely the opposite. These various changes were caused by the false saints and the people in despair. Apart from them, the many supreme emperors in the world also changed the way they behaved in the past and began to walk around the world one by one. Chapter 1730. The changes that the false saint desperation fighters brought to the world were mostly on the civilized country. They were changing the world through the changes in the civilized country. However, it was different for the supreme emperors. Their actions directly changed the world. Every move they made naturally affected the laws of the world, as well as the great Tao of the world. As a result, the laws of the world had changed quite a bit in just 100 years. This change was due to adjusting the world according to the situation of the supreme emperors, making the world more suitable for their existence, changing the essence of their existence, and unknowingly transforming the world in a more perfect direction. However, although this transformation was immediate, it did not affect the true essence of the world. Therefore, although many changes had occurred in this world because of their actions over the past 100 years, the great calamity that was about to arrive 90,000 years later would still arrive at the same time and would not continue to be brought forward. Because of this, let's not talk about the actions of the other supreme emperors for now. At this moment, Luo Fan had entered the second stage of refining the divine court heaven cauldron around the gate of chaos. At this moment, the spherical primal chaos gate was completely sucked into the three-legged cauldron and disappeared without a trace. In the end, only a small dust-like cave that led straight to the state of chaos was left. Of course, it was not accurate to describe the size of the cave as small as a speck of dust. After all, it was a gate that led straight to the state of chaos. It was a place where time and space had disappeared, and everything was in complete chaos. Size was meaningless to it. Looking at the small cave, Luo Fan's heart shook. He knew, if this cave was not blocked when the great calamity descended in the future, this location would suffer the most powerful attack. At that time, this might be the source of the world's collapse. After understanding this, he had already made a decision in his heart. With a thought, the heavenly cauldron of the divine court trembled slightly before collapsing with a loud bang. Although the divine court heaven cauldron itself was built from an endless variety of materials, however, as a pseudo-chaotic origin spiritual treasure, its own form of existence was already a mixture of tangible and intangible existence. For such an existence, there was not much difference between collapsing and transforming into another form and remaining in its original form. At this moment, although its body suddenly collapsed and turned into a ball of fine fragments, it did not affect its power much. Its own characteristics still existed. At this moment, the gray mist that was the heavenly cauldron of the divine court slowly drifted towards the cave that connected heaven and earth to the state of chaos. An indescribable suppressive force acted on the cave. The strongest ability of the heavenly cauldron was suppression. Although it had been reduced to mist, the suppression did not suffer any damage and still existed. When it burst out at this moment, it had instantly suppressed the space within a radius of tens of thousands of light years. Everything in this area seemed to have stopped. This power was nothing compared to the full power of the heavenly cauldron of the divine court. But don't forget, Luo Fan had yet to unleash the full power of the divine court heavenly cauldron. At this moment, he was doing his best to concentrate the suppressive power around the cave. Even under such circumstances, there was still such a powerful pressure leaking out, causing the space within a radius of a few tens of thousands of light years to be in such a state. This was sufficient to tell how much stronger the heavenly cauldron was compared to before. Of course, for the current Luo fan, this was obviously not enough to satisfy him. After all, this meant that the heavenly cauldron of the divine court had become more powerful. At the same time, it also meant that his control over the heavenly cauldron had weakened. His heart skipped a beat. The comprehension of the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light that Luo Fan had previously received in his heart slowly turned into an indescribable fluctuation and gradually entered the mist that the heavenly cauldron had turned into. It gradually changed the nature of the heavenly cauldron, causing the mist that the heavenly cauldron had turned into the churn. At the same time, the suppression force that had leaked out had also started to shrink. This process wasn't fast. Even after 10 days, he had only completed a small part of it. Facing this change, Luo Fan's heart moved. He took a step forward and directly arrived above the mist that the heavenly cauldron had turned into. The innate, inextinguishable spiritual light behind his head began to tremble, and an indescribable power was emitted, pouncing towards the mist that the heavenly cauldron had turned into. The power of the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light itself was extremely mysterious. It contained all sorts of inconceivable principles and unimaginable power. Now that it was directed at the heavenly cauldron, in addition to the fact that Luo Fan had been constantly pouring his comprehension of the divine court heavenly cauldron into it, the evolution process of the heavenly cauldron had started to rapidly improve. In just a day, the process that would have taken over 100 days was completed. The suppression force that the heavenly cauldron emitted had unknowingly shrunk to the range of the mist that the heavenly cauldron had turned into. At the same time, the heavenly cauldron, which was in the shape of a smoke, also began to emit a weak, eternal, and indestructible aura. Although this eternal and indestructible aura was much weaker than the aura of the false saint stage, it was much stronger in essence. If one didn't know that it was a pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure, they might even think that it was a primordial essence spirit treasure. It was just that because it had been too heavily damaged, even its aura had become dim. Such a change was enough to tell. How much had the heavenly cauldron of the divine court improved after this transformation? This process lasted for 100 days before it stopped. When everything calmed down, the divine court heavenly cauldron had completely reverted to its original three-legged round cauldron. The three-legged cauldron hovered quietly in midair. The cave leading to the chaotic state was completely blocked by the divine court heavenly cauldron. An eternal and indestructible light continuously leaked out and spread in all directions, making the surrounding time and space seem to have been controlled by the divine court heavenly cauldron. At this moment, an inexplicable multicolored light suddenly condensed in the void above the divine court heavenly cauldron. Many auspicious clouds appeared out of thin air above the divine court heavenly cauldron. At the same time, on the law layer, the great Tao, as well as the inexplicable existence that had been integrated into the great Tao, began to undergo some kind of inexplicable change. Countless inexplicable connections extended from these existences and gradually poured into the divine court heavenly cauldron. This ability to take advantage of every opening is indeed worthy of being called the heaven and earth. Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh inwardly. At this moment, he couldn't be more clear about the heaven and earth's behavior. This was clearly the heaven and earth seeing that the divine court heavenly cauldron could block the cave between the heaven and earth and the chaotic state. At this moment, it directly regarded the divine court heavenly cauldron as a part of the heaven and earth. It wanted to perfectly integrate it into the heaven and earth. Once the heaven and earth succeeded and the various changes were completed, then the divine court heavenly cauldron still belonged to Luo Fan. But at the same time, it also belonged to the heaven and earth. In other words, the divine court heavenly cauldron would no longer be an artifact or an ordinary magical treasure. Instead, it would become a natural object of the heaven and earth, an existence similar to the book of life and death, and the judge's brush. Luo Fan understood this, but he didn't stop it. He just smiled faintly and let it happen. First of all, if the divine court heavenly cauldron was taken away by the heaven and earth, it would seem that he had suffered a loss. He had offered his pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. But in fact, for him, there were countless benefits to this. After all, after merging with the heaven and earth, the divine court heavenly cauldron would naturally continue to improve in quality. Naturally, the divine court heavenly cauldron would become a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure similar to the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's Brush. Its power would increase by more than 1,000 times. With such benefits, how could Luo Fan stop it? Secondly, even if he wanted to stop it, there was nothing he could do. After all, this was the result of the great Tao, rules and laws of the heaven and earth, as well as that inexplicable existence. If Luo Fan wanted to stop it, he would have to have the strength to completely destroy the heaven and earth. Otherwise, even if he exhausted all of his strength, he would only be able to delay the change at most, but he would never be able to completely eliminate it. Under such circumstances, all Luo Fan could do was quietly watch the divine court heavenly cauldron's changes and faintly smile. This change was different from the slow change that Luo Fan had made to the divine court heavenly cauldron. In just a short 3 days, the entire change was completed. The heavenly cauldron of the divine court had completely changed its appearance. Its entire shape had undergone a subtle adjustment, and the countless lines and runes engraved on its surface had undergone an indescribable change. With these adjustments, the divine court heavenly cauldron had become many times more natural than before, and the traces of artificial refinement had completely disappeared. Luo Fan raised his hand and beckoned. The divine court heavenly cauldron had already floated in front of him. The divine court heavenly cauldron had left its original spot, but the cave that had originally existed in the state of heaven and earth and the primal chaos had completely disappeared. Time, space, matter, energy, and even the rules and laws were all calm and natural, no different from any other place. It was as if the cave that led to the state of primal chaos had never appeared there. The reason for this was very simple. The cave had completely fused with the divine court heavenly cauldron. The cave that led to the state of heaven and earth and the primal chaos was not like a hole that appeared on a fixed object. It was a more mysterious and inconceivable structure. If a hole was made on a fixed object, it would naturally be impossible to transfer the hole. However, for the world, the hole that led directly to the state of primal chaos was different. This kind of hole was used on space and time, and was connected to the position. Even distance, past, present, and future could be broken through a hole. This kind of hole, it seemed to be in a fixed position, but in fact it was just some complicated change between the state of primal chaos and the world that had projected this kind of hole here. Under such circumstances, this kind of hole could naturally be transferred. In the past, the relationship between Luo Fan's divine court heavenly cauldron and the world was still incompatible. No matter how this hole was transferred, it could not be transferred to the divine court heavenly cauldron. However, it was clearly different now. The connection between the divine court heavenly cauldron and the world was so close that the divine court heavenly cauldron had become a natural existence in the world. Naturally, it was extremely easy for the hole to be transferred to the surface. It could be done easily with a simple switch. As Luo Fan held the divine court heavenly cauldron, he felt a rather strange feeling in his hands. He felt as if he was touching an existence that he could not understand, but also as if he was touching a part of his own body. With a slight thought, he probed the divine court heavenly cauldron with his perception. In an instant, there was a gray blur. Even time and space had been completely mixed and reflected in his perception. This was similar to the previous gate of primal chaos. However, previously, the gate of primal chaos was between heaven and earth. It was an area that he could not fully control. When he sensed it, it was naturally blurry. Due to the strange state of the gate of primal chaos, it was impossible for him to see its full form. However, it was different now. Now, the gate of primal chaos had been completely transferred into his magic treasure, the divine court heavenly cauldron. Everything inside was within his perception. Naturally, he could clearly sense the form of the gate of primal chaos. The overall form of this gray blur was like a whirlpool. This whirlpool revolved around a small point in the center. Within the range of this whirlpool, time, space, matter, energy, and even nomological laws were all crushed. Moreover, this whirlpool combined in a completely different manner, forming a state that was even more mysterious than before the world had been perfected. In fact, within the range of this whirlpool, time, space, matter, energy, and even nomological laws were all twisted to pieces. In fact, it was precisely because of this state of existence that Luo Fan felt as if he had entered a state of chaos when he entered the gate of primal chaos. Through this feeling, Luo Fan understood that the gate of primal chaos was about 10 times smaller than it had been in the outside world. At this moment, there was a suppressive force acting on the whirlpool, causing it to be unable to revolve as quickly as before. This also prevented the whirlpool from expanding endlessly, preventing it from eventually swallowing the divine court heavenly cauldron and turning it into everything in the whirlpool. At this moment, Luo Fan's expression changed, and his heart was filled with an indescribable emotion. He lifted his foot and took a step forward, entering the divine court heavenly cauldron. Upon arriving, two perspectives appeared in his eyes. One was the perspective that he had previously sensed through the whirlpool as the owner of the divine court heavenly cauldron. The other was the perspective that he had when he had entered the gate of primal chaos. He had been completely affected by the gate of primal chaos and had seen everything in a blur. With another thought, Luo Fan walked towards the center of the whirlpool. The closer he got to the center of the vortex, the more he sensed that the primal chaos aura around him was becoming denser and denser. The pressure that the dusky vortex exerted on him was also increasing. If it wasn't for the fact that he was the owner of the Heaven Cauldron and was constantly being protected by the cauldron's power, he might have had to borrow the power of the innate, inextinguishable spirit light to get rid of its influence on him. Luo Fan was rather fast. Before he knew it, he had already arrived at the center of the whirlpool and saw an extremely small cave. This cave was different from the door inside, the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light that led directly to the state of chaos. Although that door led directly to the state of chaos, it was blocked by the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light because it was inside the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light. The state of chaos could not break through the power of the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light and pass through that door. However, the cave here was different. This cave was simply a hole in the world. There was no power that could completely stop the state of chaos from entering. Therefore, at this moment, however, there were countless chaotic states passing through the cave and entering the world at all times. That speed. It felt as though there were billions of worlds surging in at every moment. Of course, there were billions of energies surging out of the cave at the same time. A hole broke through the boundary between the two sides. If the outside could enter, then the inside could naturally exit as well. Fortunately, this was the interior of the Divine Court Heavenly Cauldron. The Divine Court Heavenly Cauldron's suppressive power was rather obvious. It had suppressed the speed of entry and exit by 99%. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to. Perhaps a single breath would be enough to completely crush the entire Divine Court Heavenly Cauldron and eject it out of the world. When Luo Fan saw this scene, he raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. Countless streams of energy formed from the state of chaos fell into his hand. Although these energies looked illusory, their essence was supreme, making them incomparably heavy. Just the strands of energy that fell into Luo Fan's hand had the power to completely crush a part of the world. Now that this wisp of power was pressing down on Luo Fan's hand, it made him feel as if his body was bearing the weight of billions of worlds. Even his body was emitting a gagaga sound. It's still the state of chaos after all. Luo Fan sighed. He released the strand of energy in his hand. After leaving his palm, the energy began to evolve rapidly. In a short while, it had evolved into the product of the four basic existences of time, space, matter, and energy. It merged into the dusky vortex around him. With a gentle point of his finger, the power of the divine court heavenly cauldron quickly gathered and weaved in front of him. In the blink of an eye, it turned into the outline of a formation that directly appeared around the cave. After the outline of the formation appeared, it began to rapidly absorb the power of the chaos that surged out from it. Once the chaos entered this world, unless there was an existence like the chaos seed to maintain its existence, it would definitely evolve into all sorts of unknown existences the moment it entered. Therefore, even if it was accepted at the entrance of the cave, it was impossible to directly obtain the state of chaos. Rumble, the outline of the formation, completely collapsed at this moment. All the strands formed by the power of the divine court heavenly cauldron collapsed and merged into the dusky surroundings. This was obviously because the outline of the formation could not withstand the impact of the powerful energy. Instantly, it was smashed into smithereens. This change made Luo Fan frown slightly. He knew that the outline of the formation he had casually constructed would not be able to completely contain the first evolution of the chaotic state. However, in his opinion, this kind of collapse would happen at least after a period of time, and there should be time for him to adjust the formation in between. He did not expect that it would collapse at the first instance, and he could not even react in time. So this is the case. It seems that the changes to the divine court heavenly cauldron are greater than I imagined. Such a thought flashed through his mind. Luo Fan walked away from the divine court heavenly cauldron. He had originally planned to use the formation to gather the first evolution of the chaotic state, but now it seemed that the power of the heavenly cauldron he was controlling was only the most superficial power. Clearly, he had yet to truly unleash the full potential of the heavenly cauldron. It was not the right time to gather the power. The reason for this was very simple. The outline of the formation was formed by the power of the divine court heavenly cauldron that he could control. If this was already the strongest power of the divine court heavenly cauldron, then given that the divine court heavenly cauldron could suppress the vortex and the cave that led to the state of chaos, this power should be able to remain intact under the impact of the first evolution of the state of chaos. Chapter 1731. If you have read this chapter, please go to topnovel/www.23wx.com to read the latest chapter, or directly search for Top Novel on Baidu or 23wx.com. Please remember our new website, Top Novel. If you have read this chapter, please go to the latest chapter, or directly search for Top Novel on Baidu. If you have read this chapter, please go to the latest chapter, or directly search for Top Novel on Baidu. Small, say /www. 2 to read the latest chapter, or directly search for Top Novel or www.23. Please remember our new website, Top Novel. If you have read this chapter, please go to the latest chapter, or directly search for Top Novel on Baidu. If you have read this chapter, please go to the latest chapter, or directly search for Top Novel on Baidu. Small. To read the latest chapters, you can also directly search for D-Page or www.2inch on Baidu. If you have read this chapter, please move to the latest chapter. You can also search for the latest chapter on Baidu. Please remember our new website address. If you have read this chapter, please go to topnovel/www.23wx.com to read the latest chapter, or directly search for Top Novel on Baidu or 23wx.com. Please remember our new website, Top Novel. If you have read this chapter, please go to the latest chapter, or directly search for Top Novel on Baidu. If you have read this chapter, please go to the latest chapter, or directly search for Top Novel on Baidu. Small. Say /www. 2 to read the latest chapter, or directly search for Top Novel or www.23. Please remember our new website, Top Novel. If you have read this chapter, please go to the latest chapter, or directly search for top novel on Baidu if you have read this chapter. Please go to the latest chapter or directly search for top novel on Baidu. Small. To read the latest chapters, you can also directly search for D page or www.2inch on Baidu. If you have read this chapter, please proceed to the latest chapter. You can also search for the latest chapter on Baidu. Please remember our new website address. If you have read this chapter, please go to topnovel/www.23wx.com to read the latest chapter or directly search for top novel on Baidu or www.23wx.com. And please remember our new website, Apex Fiction. If you have read this chapter, please proceed to the latest chapter. You can also search directly on Baidu. Please remember our new website address. If you have read this chapter, please move to page D. Small. To read the latest chapters, you can also search for top novel or www.2inch on Baidu. 3. And please remember our new website, Vertex Fiction. If you have read this chapter, please proceed to the latest chapter. You can also search directly on Baidu. Please remember our new website address. If you have read this chapter, please move to page D. Small. To read the latest chapters, you can also directly search for D page or www.2inch on Baidu. Chapter 1732. When he arrived outside the Divine Court Heavenly Cauldron, Luo Fan gently waved his hand, and the Divine Court Heavenly Cauldron suddenly fell into his hand. After holding the Divine Court Heavenly Cauldron, his mind moved, and his consciousness slowly seeped into the Divine Court Heavenly Cauldron. He carefully sensed every bit of its internal structure. He had already refined the Divine Court Heavenly Cauldron when it was only a pseudo-sage treasure in the beginning. Now that it had been upgraded to this level, every bit of change was clearly formed under his control. Therefore, Luo Fan was very clear about all the details and mysteries of the Divine Court Heavenly Cauldron before this. However, this was also before this. After being refined by this world, this pseudo-sage origin spiritual treasure was now a world of difference from the original one. At this moment, Luo Fans will seeped into it and began to carefully sense the details and mysteries of the entire magic treasure. He discovered that there were countless structures that he couldn't understand, but it was clear that they contained infinite principles and profound mysteries. These structures were not much inferior to the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light in terms of level. Even with Luo Fan's perception and comprehension ability, he actually felt a little lost in the face of this structure. Looking at this scene, an inexplicable joy appeared on Luo Fan's face. If all the structures of the Divine Court Heavenly Cauldron were within the scope of his understanding, then what was the benefit of comprehending this Divine Court Heavenly Cauldron? Could it be that he was a little bored because there was still some time before the arrival of the great calamity of the world? It was only like this, where he had never comprehended or sensed the mysteries of this endless principle and structure before, that he could gain more benefits through comprehending the changes within. All these thoughts flashed through his mind, and Luo Fan began to wholeheartedly comprehend the mysteries of the Divine Court Heavenly Cauldron structure. Once he comprehended it, he could feel endless truths and mysteries flowing into his mind through his connection with the Divine Court Sky Cauldron. After all, he was the owner of the Heavenly Cauldron of the Divine Court, and he had even treated the Heavenly Cauldron as his false saint body. Under such circumstances, he was naturally very closely connected to the structure of the Heavenly Cauldron. The close connection between the Heavenly Cauldron of the Divine Court was very important to him. Of course, there were countless conveniences, although it was a little exaggerated to directly receive information like this. It was not incomprehensible. Sensing this information, Luo Fan began to quickly activate his mind and began to quickly understand this information, constantly extracting the principles that were beneficial to him. In fact, all the things that were beneficial to the perfection of his worldview were scattered and integrated into his worldview. During this process, the passage of time gradually left him. He floated quietly in the void, gradually becoming like a natural landscape in this world. His presence became weaker and weaker, and finally became completely undetectable. Time flew by. In a trance, it seemed like thousands of years had passed, but it also seemed like only a moment had passed. On this day, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He suddenly found that he had come into contact with the core of the heavenly cauldron. The heavenly cauldron, which was originally connected to his flesh and blood, seemed to have become his limbs. All of its power and changes were instantly understood by him. Did I succeed? At this moment, Luo Fan recovered from the state where he couldn't feel the time of the outside world. He had an inexplicable look of doubt on his face. At this moment, he still hadn't completely comprehended all the mysteries of the heavenly cauldron. He couldn't be clearer about this. But he also had a feeling that he could completely control the might of this pseudo-primordial spirit treasure. He could control this pseudo-primordial spirit treasure to do whatever he wanted it to do. This inexplicable contradiction made him fall into a rare moment of doubt. His heart skipped a beat. Luo Fan came back to his senses. At this moment, he made a slight calculation and understood that there was only a mere 10,000 years left until the arrival of the great calamity. In other words, when he had fallen into that inexplicable state, nearly 80,000 years had passed without him realizing it. I can't believe it took me so long to reach this step. After understanding how much time had passed, Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh inwardly. He had originally planned to spend a few thousand years to master the heavenly cauldron, but he didn't expect that it would take him 10 times more time than he had expected. Moreover, at this moment, he couldn't even be sure whether he had completely mastered the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. With a slight sigh, his heart moved. In the center of the gray vortex inside the heavenly cauldron, the outline of a formation appeared out of thin air around the cave that led to the chaotic state. The outline of the formation was condensed from the power of the heavenly cauldron. On the surface, it didn't look much different from the outline of the formation that Luo Fan had condensed for the first time. But this was only on the surface. The strength of the outline of the formation was countless times stronger than before. Previously, the outline of the formation had only withstood the impact of the first evolution of the chaotic state before collapsing with a loud bang. But now, the outline of the formation was frantically absorbing the power of the first evolution of the chaotic state. It was absorbing the endless power contained within and fusing it into the outline of the formation. This caused the outline of the formation to quickly break away from its original state and gradually evolve into a brand new, perfect formation. This formation was so powerful and mysterious. After it appeared, it began to spread continuously and gradually fuse with the entire vortex. The moment the formation completely fused with the vortex, the formation once again produced a powerful attractive force that directly acted on the vortex. As the formation took effect, the entire vortex began to rapidly dissipate. All the power contained within, all the time, space, and matter was completely absorbed by the formation. Not long after, the only thing left inside the heavenly cauldron was the huge formation and the cave that led to the chaotic state. The interior of the heavenly cauldron became clear. The formation was incomparably complicated and mysterious. Faintly, there was a hint of innate, inextinguishable spiritual light. It crazily absorbed the endless power of the first evolution in the state of chaos, constantly enriching the formation, causing the formation to evolve again, or rather, transform. Time after time, it was opened up inside the formation. At first, these spacetimes were extremely weak and could not withstand the impact of the first evolution of the chaotic state. As the formation continued to absorb that power, it was constantly crushed by that power, destroyed, and turned back into different kinds of power. However, the appearance of this spacetime was a natural evolution of the formation. As long as the array was not destroyed, it would not disappear. It was impossible for the birth of spacetime to be cut off. Therefore, although it was constantly being destroyed and minced into pieces, Every time it was destroyed and minced into pieces, space-time would be born out of thin air and continuously filled the interior of the array, causing the interior of the array to gradually turn into a tragic scene of life and death. Billions of space-time. Among the billions of worlds, there would always be one or two structures that coincidentally formed structures that could withstand the impact of the first evolved power in this chaotic state. Therefore, as time passed, the number of spacetimes that could withstand the impact of that power increased. In just a few days, there were already more than a dozen spacetimes that appeared. These spacetimes that could withstand the impact of that power began to turn around and constantly absorb that power, turning it into resources for their own growth. As it began to gradually improve, the spacetimes continued to strengthen, and the laws gradually became more perfect. There was also a probability of this. Not all the surviving spacetimes could absorb that power and turn it into resources for their own growth. Among the thousands of spacetimes, only a single spacetime could do this. Therefore, although there were already more than a dozen spacetimes that could survive in a few days, but after a year, there were only 20 spacetimes left in the formation. They began to extract the power and pour it into those spacetimes, allowing them to grow continuously. Unknowingly, these 20 spacetimes had already been perfected to a rather shocking state. Although they had not truly become a perfect world, they had almost reached the end of the Great Thousand World. The great Tao and laws that existed within had been perfected to the point that even supreme emperors would be restricted if they entered. Such a space-time was still lacking compared to the world that Luo Fan was in at this moment. But it was clearly comparable to any world in Earth's universe. And this seemed to have reached the limit of the Divine Court Heavenly Cauldron, or in other words, the formation that Luo Fan had created with the help of the Divine Court Heavenly Cauldron. These 20 worlds formed an extremely complicated and profound structure. This structure was extremely stable, but at the same time, it also rejected the formation of all other spacetimes and worlds. Any spacetime that wanted to be born in this process would directly collapse and be destroyed by the powerful pressure of the 20 worlds before it could be impacted by the first evolved power in the chaotic state. And there was clearly a limit to the absorption of the first evolved power by the 20 worlds. As time passed, as the growth rate of those worlds increased, more and more energy constantly surged out from those worlds and returned to the chaotic state through the hole that led to the chaotic state. Of course, at the same time, it was also constantly absorbing the first evolved power in the chaotic state, forming an extremely profound balance. From this point of view, this formation and the 20 world within it had replaced the mysterious gray vortex that originally existed inside the Divine Court's Heaven Cauldron and became the main body that balanced the chaotic state inside the Divine Court's Heaven Cauldron. Although only a short amount of time had passed in the outside world, it had been hundreds of millions of years in the world. At this moment, in those worlds, countless flourishing civilizations had already been born in those worlds. There were also countless powerful cultivators in those civilizations, and there were even fake Christmases born among them. But right now, there was an extremely intense war going on in those worlds. And what they were fighting for wasn't anything else. It was the first evolved power in the chaotic state that was being spat out from the hole. Although the first evolved power in the chaotic state was endless, most of it was completely blasted into the 20 worlds. The way it appeared and disappeared was all beyond the sensing range of the countless living beings within. And this resulted in a result. Those living beings, even the false saints among them, could sense that the world was constantly absorbing some kind of power that could make them stronger. And they couldn't find it at all. In this way, in order to break through, the false saints who had almost gone crazy would naturally target that kind of power. Many false saints had set their goals on the same thing, so conflicts would inevitably arise. Therefore, the appearance of war was also a matter of course. Looking at everything that was happening inside the Divine Court Heavenly Cauldron, Luo Fan was in a daze. It was as if he could see his own shadow. The power they were fighting for was nothing in his eyes, but could it be that he was much stronger than them? Perhaps, in the eyes of some higher-level existence, all the efforts he had put in to become a true saint, and all the battles he had with others were nothing more than the false saints in front of him. Thinking of this, Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh. With a thought, his consciousness had already left the divine court heavenly cauldron and returned to his body. After returning here, with a thought, he could already feel that the power of the divine court heavenly cauldron was thousands of times richer than before. The power of the divine court heavenly cauldron itself was already completely fixed when it was successfully refined. This was something that Luo Fan couldn't change at all. However, this didn't mean that Luo Fan couldn't think of a way to strengthen the divine court heavenly cauldron in his hands. In fact, everything that Luo Fan had done previously was to strengthen the divine court heavenly cauldron in his hands. Before this, there was only one vortex in the divine court heavenly cauldron. Although it wouldn't affect the level of its power, it would still be at the level it should be at. It wouldn't decrease because of this. However, this made it extremely difficult to control the power of the divine court heavenly cauldron. In other words, with Luo Fan's current realm, he couldn't control the divine court heavenly cauldron to a very detailed level. Under normal circumstances, he could only activate the suppression power that existed within it. When facing an enemy, he could only fully unleash it to suppress his opponent. However, he couldn't choose different methods according to the opponent, for example, different suppression methods. This was, of course, possible under normal circumstances. However, in the face of the abnormal appearance of the first great tribulation of the world, this method of using power was obviously insufficient. Therefore, what Luo Fan needed to do was to change the crudeness of the divine court heavenly cauldron and replace it with a more detailed method. And at this moment, from the internal structure of the divine court heavenly cauldron, it was obvious that he wanted to change the state of the vortex within it and replace it with a more detailed and complex system. According to this principle, the array within the heavenly cauldron of the divine court, as well as the structure of the 20 worlds within the array, had clearly reached the target that Luo Fan wanted. With a thought, the divine court heavenly cauldron in Luo Fan's hand turned slightly and turned into a completely different image. It directly turned into a bronze mirror. On one side, it looked like the bronze mirror inside the connate inextinguishable spirit light, the bronze mirror that Luo Fan had used a portion of the connate inextinguishable spirit light to evolve. After the copper mirror appeared, it naturally exuded an aura that was similar to the copper mirror. It was eternal and indestructible. It felt like the copper mirror had really broken away from the connate inextinguishable spiritual light and appeared in his hand. After the bronze mirror appeared, Luo Fan's heart moved slightly. As he poured his power into it, the bronze mirror emitted a ray of light that shone into the void in front of him. Under the light, the laws of heaven and earth, and even the hidden great Tao, inexplicably trembled. As it trembled, the laws of heaven and earth within the area, illuminated by the light, seemed to be completely distorted and transformed into a completely different form from the laws of heaven and earth as a whole, emitting an aura that was completely different from this world. Sure enough, it's possible to carry out this kind of simulation. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan smiled. The divine court heavenly cauldron was still the divine court heavenly cauldron, although it seemed to have turned into the bronze mirror that was only on the surface. This was a kind of simulation, a simulation of other powerful magic treasures through the various internal structures of the divine court heavenly cauldron. Of course, the level of the divine court heavenly cauldron itself was still there. The other magic treasures it could simulate were fine and could display almost all of their power. However, this chaotic origin spiritual treasure was clearly different. The power of the magic treasure it simulated was only a millionth of a real chaotic origin spiritual treasure. Although this was already extremely terrifying, the difference in level was still obvious at a glance. Suddenly, Luo Fan's heart stirred. He raised his hand and took out a cone-shaped fragment of the chaotic origin spiritual treasure. Maybe I could try to simulate this magic treasure. Such an idea emerged in his mind. Thinking of this, his heart couldn't help but beat a little faster. This fragment of the chaotic origin spiritual treasure had been in his hands for a long time. But all this time, he had no idea what the fragment looked like as a whole. As for who had refined this primordial origin spirit treasure, it was completely unknown. After using it to escape several life and death crises, how could he not be curious about these answers? All kind of thoughts flashed through his mind. In the end, Luo Fan finally made up his mind. He raised his hand and waved the bronze mirror in his hand. In an instant, the bronze mirror had already turned into the shape of a three-legged cauldron. It still looked simple and natural like before. It still looked so mysterious and incredible. Then, Luo Fan smoothly threw the irregular cone-shaped fragment in his other hand into the heavenly cauldron of the divine court. After his modifications, the heavenly cauldron of the divine court originally had a process of displaying the power of a dragon. It had already been broken down into countless details. As for these details, so long as they were combined differently, they would naturally be able to form different Dharma treasures and display different powers. This was the fundamental reason why the heavenly cauldron of the divine court could simulate the bronze mirror-like chaotic origin spiritual treasure. At this moment, the moment the fragment of the chaotic origin spiritual treasure was thrown into the heavenly cauldron of the divine court, Luo Fan suddenly felt that all the internal structure of the heavenly cauldron of the divine court seemed to have been injected with chicken blood, and it began to move crazily. The entire three-legged cauldron began to tremble violently. As it trembled, it suddenly broke free from Luo Fan's control, directly floated in front of Luo Fan, and began to slowly spin. Seeing this, Luo Fan did not dare to be negligent. With a thought, the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light behind his head suddenly emitted an inexplicable power, directly shrouding his body, and gave him a layer of the most powerful and tightest defense in the world. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that within the heavenly cauldron, there was a powerful force constantly pouring into the fragment. After being refined and changed by the fragment, it continued to gush out, gradually turning into a power that was countless times stronger than before, gradually condensing into a six-fingered palm around it. Seeing this, Luo Fan narrowed his eyes and was about to move. He found that the heavenly cauldron suddenly hummed, and the power pouring into the fragment suddenly began to change rapidly. Along with the change, the six-fingered palm trembled slightly and suddenly collapsed, turning into a completely irregularly shaped power, trying to reform around the fragment. Seeing this, Luo Fan was a little relieved. At this time, the power of the heavenly cauldron of the divine court changed once again, transforming into various kinds of power that Luo Fan had either seen before or never seen before. Moreover, it changed at an unimaginable frequency, almost never in a stable state. Chapter 1733. This change in power continued for hundreds of millions or trillions of times. In the beginning, Luo Fan could still roughly understand what the divine court heaven cauldron was doing. He could feel that the primordial spiritual treasure fragment was resisting the changes in the power of the divine court heaven cauldron. But as time passed, as the number of changes increased, in the end, all the changes gradually exceeded the limit of his understanding. In the end, he could only see the power change, and the power that gushed out of the magic treasure fragment was also changing, but he couldn't understand the specific changes. Even if the source of this change was his magic treasure, the divine court heaven cauldron, he still couldn't understand it. From this, it could be seen how much the divine court heaven cauldron had improved. Sensing all of this, Luo Fan had an inexplicable helplessness on his face. Sighing slightly, he could only quietly wait for the divine court heaven cauldron to appear and change. After an unknown period of time, the divine court heaven cauldron suddenly shook. Then, the primordial spiritual treasure fragment was directly spat out like garbage. Fortunately, Luo Fan was vigilant of all changes in the divine court heaven cauldron at this time. Seeing the fragment leave the divine court heaven cauldron, he casually scooped it up in his hand. Just as the change was completed, the divine court heaven cauldron gradually began to wriggle. Is it going to appear? Luo Fan looked at this scene, and such a thought flashed in his mind. The change in front of him was clearly a sign that the divine court heaven cauldron was transforming into another form of a primordial spiritual treasure. And according to what the divine court heaven cauldron had been doing, it could be imagined that it was transforming into a primordial spiritual treasure. It must be the primordial spiritual treasure corresponding to the primordial spiritual treasure fragment. The divine court heaven cauldron wriggled faster and faster, and more intense. In the end, the entire divine court heaven cauldron slightly shook. It had completely transformed into a strange form. It was a gourd. One was the size of a palm and looked quite pocket-sized. The material looked extremely simple and unadorned. It seemed to be a gourd that had just been plucked from a gourd vine. It did not look like a magic treasure. This is what the primordial origin spiritual treasure looks like. Luo Fan was shocked. He gently waved his hand, and the gourd fell into his hand. Suddenly, he felt his entire body become heavy. Immediately after, endless negative emotions swarmed out of the gourd and poured directly into his soul, directly reaching the source of his life. In a trance, he lost all sense of his body and the outside world, falling into an indescribable universe of negative emotions. Moreover, the negative emotion universe in front of him was more realistic and more powerful than any negative emotion universe he had seen before. In this universe of negative emotions, he even felt a sense of supremacy, omniscience, and omnipotence. Eternal and indestructible, a terrifying aura that could not be worn down by 10,000 tribulations. That was the aura of a true divine. Clearly, the universe of negative emotions in front of them. There was a terrifying existence like the true divine. At this moment, he suddenly felt many eyes looking at him. In an instant, he felt as if all his secrets had been seen through by the owner of those eyes. At this moment, an inexplicable repulsive force was produced in this universe of negative emotions. His soul had no ability to resist at all. It was blasted out of this universe of negative emotions by this repulsive force and returned directly to his body. He was still holding the ancient pocket-sized gourd, and he was still floating in the void, even. He also felt that there was no difference between the time now and the time before. After entering the universe of negative emotions for dozens of breaths, the time in the outside world did not pass at all. What's going on? With a thought, Luo Fan had such a thought. Why are there so many true sages? Then, this thought replaced the previous one in his mind. Although the time he spent in the universe of negative emotions was short, and he did not sense many things. However, based on what he had sensed, he could already confirm that in that universe of negative emotions, there were at least more than 100 true sages. A world, even a strange world like the universe of negative emotions, had more than 100 true sages. How incredible was this? Could it be that the world I entered was not an ordinary world, but a grand world? At this moment, such a thought suddenly appeared in Luo Fan's mind. Once this thought appeared, it was like maggots in a tarsal bone, and he could not get rid of it. The only grand world he had seen was the Great Tianyuan world. In the Great Tianyuan world, there were a total of 800 true sages, which was more than 100 times more than the 7 true sages in the universe on Earth. If that universe of negative emotions was really a real world, no matter how he thought about it, the only possibility was that it was a grand world. What exactly is this gourd? Why can I enter that universe of negative emotions just by holding it? It was the same before. When I obtained the first fragment, I directly entered a sea of negative emotions. When I obtained the second fragment, I entered a relatively weaker universe of negative emotions. When I obtained the third fragment, I entered a universe of negative emotions with a false sage that was close to a true sage. Now that I have simulated the entire body of this magic treasure, I can directly enter the universe of negative emotions with 100 true sages. Luo Fan fell into an inexplicable state of irritation. In his heart, he could faintly feel that this magic treasure contained endless secrets. If he could obtain these secrets, it would be able to greatly expand his view of the world. However, no matter how he thought about it. He couldn't figure it out no matter how much he thought about it. With all kinds of thoughts and all kinds of irritation in his mind, Luo Fan had an idea, and he channeled his own power into the gourd. At this moment, the gourd suddenly emitted a ray of light. This ray of light was like a ray of sunlight, and at first glance, it could even be overlooked. However, after it appeared, the nomological layer of this world seemed to have been forcibly stuffed into something bigger than this world, and it began to produce extreme distortions. If it was not the nomological layer of the nomological layer, it would not be something else. Its endurance was beyond imagination, and perhaps it was because of this change. It was already enough to mince the nomological layer of the nomological layer into pieces. However, even so, this had already caused the nomological layer of the nomological layer to undergo a huge change, and it looked as if it would completely collapse in the next instant. And this change caused the space-time around this ray of light to become extremely chaotic, as if there were countless worlds born around this ray of light, and it also seemed as if the shadows of countless worlds were projected around this ray of light. At this moment, that ray of light condensed slightly, and it had already turned into a ball. With a slight tremble, this space-time suddenly shattered. A cave that led straight to the state of chaos directly appeared at the position where the ball of light had rushed past. Endless chaotic aura surged out from it, causing the surroundings to become gray and hazy. Seeing this scene, even Luo Fan could not help but be shocked. He couldn't be any clearer about how powerful this world was. Even he, if he wanted to destroy the space-time of this world and shatter the nomological layer of the nomological layer of the nomological layer, he would need to expend endless energy. He might even need to borrow the power of the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light to achieve this. And even if he shattered the nomological layer of the nomological layer and destroyed space-time, he would at most reach the gap between the world and the state of chaos. He would not be able to directly reach the state of chaos, let alone shatter the repulsive force of the world against the state of chaos, allowing the state of chaos to surge in. However, this primordial origin spiritual treasure, simulated by the divine court heavenly cauldron, possessed such power. Under the effect of this small ball of light, space-time was destroyed. The nomological layer of the nomological layer was shattered, and even the barrier between the world and the state of chaos was completely broken. The repulsive force of the world against the state of chaos was completely eliminated. This allowed the state of chaos to actually swarm in. Seeing that the gray state of chaos was about to touch him, Luo Fan did not dare to be negligent. His figure flickered, and he disappeared on the spot. When he reappeared, he was already hundreds of thousands of miles away from his original position. When he reappeared, the gray existence had already shattered the space-time in front of him. It was only a few dozen feet away from touching him. At this moment, the laws of the world trembled slightly. A mysterious power surged out and began to pounce towards him from all directions. It rapidly shattered the gray existence in front of him and continuously reconstructed the space-time and nomological layer of the nomological layer that was shattered by the gray existence. Not long after, everything calmed down. Everything in front of him was clear, and everything had returned to normal. The hole that was blasted out by the ball of light, which led to the state of chaos, had been completely repaired by the world. At this moment, only then did Luo Fan return to his senses. He lowered his head and looked at the gourd in his hand. At this moment, the gourd had already become extremely blurry, and its form was gradually fading. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan had a look of understanding and disappointment on his face. He suddenly understood that the divine court heavenly cauldron's essence was too weak. Although it could barely imitate a chaotic origin spiritual treasure, it couldn't maintain it for long. Once the chaotic origin spiritual treasure's power was activated, it would lose its form due to the impact of the reaction force and revert to the appearance of the divine court heavenly cauldron. But this was also the reason why he was disappointed. Such a restriction made it so that although the power of the imitation was terrifying, it could only be used once, and its usefulness was greatly reduced. Just as he was thinking about this, The artifact in front of him had already turned into a three-legged cauldron that quietly floated in front of him. Even the divine court heavenly cauldron seemed a lot dimmer at this moment. Its aura was worlds apart from its peak state at the beginning. It was obvious that it had consumed too much energy. With a thought, Luo Fan poured his will into the world of the divine court heavenly cauldron. With this, he discovered that the 20 worlds in the formation inside the divine court heavenly cauldron had all become dilapidated. More than 90% of the living beings within them had died. It felt as if they had experienced the end of the world. Although the cave that led to the state of chaos still had endless chaos surging in at all times, constantly evolving into the first evolved power of the state of chaos. But if he wanted to make up for it completely, it obviously couldn't be done in a short period of time. It seems like it will take a lot of time to recover after this. It will take a lot of time to recover, Luo Fan thought. The changes in these worlds were obviously caused by the divine court heavenly cauldron's imitation of the gourd's attack. In order for it to be able to make that attack again, obviously, these worlds needed to be restored to their original prosperous and powerful state. And this obviously needed time. This time would definitely be longer than the time it took to build these worlds from scratch. There was no other reason than that the destructive power was still in those worlds. If these worlds wanted to prosper again, they had to first get rid of that power. This was the main reason why it would take so much time. He sighed softly. Luo Fan could only rely on his own power to adjust the formation slightly, so that the formation's focus would be on getting rid of the destructive power in those worlds. With this adjustment, he had already roughly calculated that it would take at least 3 years for these worlds to recover to their peak. It's really a pity that it takes 3 years to cool down. Luo Fan sighed inwardly. Then his will returned to his body, and he conveniently put the divine court heavenly cauldron into his universe in the sleeve. Now that he had this divine court heavenly cauldron, although it could only unleash that terrifying attack once, he was absolutely confident that he could easily survive this great tribulation. However, with this strike, he had absolute confidence that he would be able to easily survive this tribulation. He no longer needed to exert any more strength on the heavenly cauldron of the divine court. After putting it away, Luo Fan took out the gourd-shaped fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure and let it float in front of him. He began to sense the fragment in front of him in unprecedented detail. Just by using the heavenly cauldron of the divine court to simulate the primordial origin spiritual treasure, he was able to let his mind enter such a powerful universe of negative emotions that seemed to be a world of its own. It was easy to imagine how incredible the primordial origin spiritual treasure was. He slowly wrapped his perception around the fragment in front of him and slowly seeped into it. The structure of this fragment was extremely mysterious. It was extremely complicated, but also extremely natural. It seemed to be a naturally occurring fragment. No matter how hard Luo Fan tried to sense it, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find any traces of artificiality. As for the mystery of the structure, he couldn't see or understand it at all. At this time, he seemed to have become a primary school student again, facing that incomparably complicated mathematical conjecture. Luo Fan had already expected this situation, but he wasn't discouraged at all. This time, he wasn't trying to comprehend the fragment in front of him because he wanted to know the secrets of this fragment. Instead, he wanted to find the connection between this fragment and the universe of negative emotions. As Luo Fan went deeper, the internal structure of this fragment became more and more complex and mysterious. It felt as if more and more complex structures and profound principles were being derived from the fragment as he probed deeper and deeper. There was no need to say more about Luo Fan's amazing perception ability. In just a few short breaths, he felt that he had gone deep into the depths of hundreds of millions of layers. At this step, the internal structure of the fragment was even more complex than the internal structure of the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light. At least, it was more complex than the internal structure of the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light behind Luo Fan's head. There seemed to be hundreds of millions of principles and mysteries of the world within it. Every time he thought about it, he seemed to be able to come into contact with a completely different but equally profound mystery. Facing such a change, Luo Fan could only admire in his heart. However, he didn't stop at all. Instead, he continued to go deeper and dig into the interior of this fragment. Just like that, time passed by slowly. In a trance, tens of thousands of years had passed, and the depths that Luo Fan had gone into in the fragment had reached a realm that couldn't be described with numbers. And now, the internal structure of the fragment that he had come into contact with was so complex and mysterious that it made him feel as if his mind had sunk into the depths of the origin of the realm. Although Luo Fan's perception ability and digging ability were so powerful that they were almost heaven-defying, but there was still a limit. After tens of thousands of years, he had gone to a depth that almost made him lose himself, and he finally felt that it was strenuous. It was as if an increasingly powerful repulsive force was being generated from the depths of this fragment, constantly affecting his perception. It made it harder and harder for him to move forward. In a trance, there was also a feeling of powerlessness that gradually filled his heart. So, this is the primal origin spiritual treasure. This is an existence at the true saint level. A thought emerged in his heart. A faint wry smile hung on his face. For tens of thousands of years, he didn't care about the structure and mysteries within, and he continued to dig deeper and deeper. Under normal circumstances, even if it was a perfect world, he should have been able to come into contact with some of the deepest mysteries. But at this moment, he still felt that he was only wandering around the surface of this fragment, and what he had come into contact with seemed to be only the surface of the mysteries contained within this fragment. This situation made him feel once again how huge the gap between him and an existence at the true saint level was. Once again, he clearly understood how great the gap that he wanted to cross next was. After a wry smile, Luo Fan's expression quickly became firm. This time, I must gain something. This thought completely dispelled all the irritation and cowardice that had previously surged out of him. He no longer cared about anything else. He continued the previous process, constantly sending his perception deeper into the depths of the fragment, heading towards the seemingly non-existent end. Time slowly passed during this process. The time for the arrival of the great tribulation of heaven and earth was getting closer and closer. In this world, more and more living beings could sense the existence of the great tribulation of heaven and earth. At first, it was the false saints, then the false saints, and then more. Even the quasi-saints. In the end, when there was still 100 years before the great tribulation of heaven and earth would arrive, the world was already shrouded by an indescribable pressure. Almost even those living beings who had yet to become immortals could use some special deduction methods. Some special abilities could sense that the great tribulation of heaven and earth was approaching. Because of such a change, this world had long lost its previous vitality. A sense of panic, as if the end of the world was about to arrive, surged back and forth in the endless space-time of the entire world. If it weren't for the false saints, despair, and supreme emperor suppressing it, this world might have already fallen into chaos. It was even possible that a terrifying war that involved the entire world would break out, causing this world to become extremely dilapidated before the great tribulation of heaven and earth arrived. It might even be directly destroyed. Of course, from a certain point of view, this could also be considered a part of the great tribulation of heaven and earth. Now that it was being suppressed by so many experts, it was because they had used another method to survive a small wave of the tribulation. Luo Fan didn't care about all the changes in this world at all. To him, he had already done everything he could. He had a clear conscience about all the changes that would happen in the world next. At this moment, he was more concerned about the primordial origin spiritual treasure fragment in front of him. After tens of thousands of years, the number of layers he had entered had already exceeded the limit that could be described by numbers. There was an inexplicable fluctuation slowly emitting from his body. His eyes were extremely solemn, and the power in his body was slightly fluctuating. In fact, even his aura was a little chaotic. If it weren't for the innate, indestructible spiritual light behind his head suppressing it, the fluctuation of his aura would definitely leak out. At that time, perhaps the space-time within a radius of hundreds of millions of light years would become chaotic. Because of it, I'm almost there. An inexplicable premonition emerged in Luo Fan's heart. Of course, the target that he was about to reach wasn't the true source of this fragment. Instead, it was what he wanted to find in this fragment. It was something related to the universe of negative emotions, whether it was its structure, its mysteries, or some other existence. As for the source of the fragment, he had completely given up on it now. After so many years of probing, he finally understood that if he didn't become a true saint, it would be impossible for him to come into contact with the source. Chapter 1734. In order to break through this repulsive force, Luo Fan had already exerted almost all of his strength at this moment. It was precisely because of this that he seemed to be having a hard time at this moment. At this moment, he had already faintly felt that a target that he needed was right in front of him. That fragment was extremely mysterious and contained endless mysteries. Moreover, it even had the effect of a true divine theurgy, which could produce an almost infinite number of changes according to all the changes in the outside world. This variety of changes was incomparably complicated. If one wanted to exhaust all the secrets in it and completely collect all the principles and mysteries in it, there was naturally no shortcut. He needed to reach the level of a true divine in order to be able to do it. However, if one only wanted to obtain a part of the mysteries, it was obviously not so absolute. Just like what Luo Fan was doing at this moment, under the guidance of his true inner desire, the direction and goal that he delved into was the existence that was related to the universe of negative emotions. It was also precisely because he set his goal on that existence that he had the opportunity to reach that goal. After an unknown period of time, in a trance, Luo Fan felt his mind relax. He suddenly broke through a strange layer of barrier and stepped into an inexplicable place. This is the existence that is related to the universe of negative emotions. This thought surfaced in Luo Fan's mind at this moment. While thinking about this, Luo Fan felt that his surroundings were filled with some strange things that seemed to be extremely familiar to him, but also seemed to be extremely strange to him. Through his perception, at a glance, he found that there were countless, densely packed runes and endless lines around him. These runes and lines were constructed in a way that he could not understand. They formed a strange whole. It was also the aura that was released by this strange whole that made Luo Fan feel both familiar and strange. This sense of familiarity was that if he were to sense it at first, he would feel as if he had entered the universe of negative emotions. It was just that the extraordinary corrosive effect of the universe of negative emotions was not there. However, what was strange was that if he carefully observed his surroundings, he would find that this was not a universe of negative emotions at all. This was simply a strange structure that was formed by some kind of runes and power. Facing such a change, there was only an inexplicable expression on Luo Fan's face, but his heart was filled with an indescribable change. Finally found it, he murmured. How could he not understand the situation in front of him? It was because of this strange structure that he had fallen into the universe of negative emotions when he had obtained the fragments of the primordial spiritual treasure. This was also why he had used the power of the divine court heavenly cauldron to simulate the primordial spiritual treasure to enter the negative emotions of a true divine. Although the surrounding structure was extremely complex and incomparably profound. However, Luo Fan was still unwilling to give up the idea of comprehending its mysteries. At this moment, he spread out his perception, doing his best to remember the surrounding structure and sense the mysteries of all the structures around him. What is going on? What did it do? This structure. It's unexpectedly simple. Suddenly, Luo Fan discovered an inconceivable fact. He thought that these structures would be more complicated than he could imagine, and that he would have to surpass the Emperor level. Only by stepping into the true divine level could one comprehend a little bit of it. However, He did not expect that the development of the structure in front of him was beyond his expectations. Although it was deep and complicated, he was actually able to grasp a trace of it. He could actually comprehend the mysteries of these structures. How is this possible? This was a fragment of the primordial spiritual treasure, not a pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure or even a great overarching heavenly treasure. This kind of existence could only be refined and comprehended by those at the true divine level. As a third-level martial emperor, he might be extremely powerful in the eyes of others. However, there was still a long way to go before he could reach the true divine level. Just as Luo Fan was thinking about all these things, the countless structures around him suddenly began to change rapidly. It was as if some kind of power had suddenly activated the various structures around him. As the structure changed, a strange silhouette gradually appeared. It condensed in his eyes. This strange figure was in the shape of a human. However, it was not the human form of a born Taoism aptitude that Luo Fan was familiar with. This figure had 3 arms, each with 6 fingers, and its head had 2 faces. Although it also had facial features, it looked different from a born Taoism aptitude. In an instant, an inexplicable understanding emerged in Luo Fan's heart. This is the true divine who refined this gourd-shaped, primordial spiritual treasure. As he realized this, an indescribable vigilance was born in his heart. The existence of a true divine was much stronger than his current level. No matter what it was, whether it was an aura, a shadow, a figure, or even other more illusory existences, as long as it was related to a true divine, it was an unimaginable threat to him. If the other party wanted to deal with him, he was afraid that even the chance of escaping would be extremely small. In such a situation, if Luo Fan did not feel a strong sense of vigilance because of the existence of a true divine, then he would have cultivated to this level in vain. He would have traveled so many worlds in vain. At this time, the surrounding structure had completely disappeared, replaced by an inexplicable nothingness. This kind of nothingness was even more thorough than any of the nothingness Luo Fan had encountered. Even the nothingness between the heavens and realms was still a far cry from the nothingness in front of him. In the nothingness between the heavens and realms, Luo Fan could still freely exist and would not be affected in any way. But in this place, in this void, he felt as if his body was about to turn into nothingness. At this moment, strands of his perception started to dissipate continuously, although the speed at which it dissipated was not fast. At least compared to the strength of his perception, it was not too fast. But after all, it was dissipating. This was a great shock to him. Take it back. At this time, such a thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. What he wanted to take back was, of course, the perception that he had deeply engraved in the depths of the primordial origin spiritual treasure fragment. However, it was a pity that at this moment, the connection between his perception and his body seemed to have been cut off by this nothingness. No matter how hard he tried, he could not transmit the slightest thought to his body. There was no way for him to completely retract this bit of perception. The two were like 2 completely independent existences, and now they were in a completely different space-time dimension. Space-time dimension. That's right. I am now in a completely different space-time dimension from the original one. Only in this way can such a situation occur. Luo Fan's mind suddenly flashed with this realization. In this moment of enlightenment, he felt a little more at ease. The appearance of this situation, but it was not that this nothingness had completely isolated the connection between his perception and his body. In fact, it was only because his perception and his body were in a completely different space-time dimension. This caused this connection to be delayed, or it could be said that it had become different. This delay, this lack of synchronization, although the two were clearly connected, the information communication between them could not be synchronized at all. The information of his perception had indeed been transmitted, but it was impossible to determine when it would enter his body. Perhaps it might take a few breaths to transmit, or perhaps it might not be transmitted to his body for thousands or tens of thousands of years. It was precisely because of this that his main body and his perception had been completely cut off, and the two of them could no longer communicate with each other. In fact, this was the same way as the connection between the avatar and the main body between the two perfect worlds. Between the two perfect worlds, the information transmission between the avatar and the main body was this way of completely confusing space-time. Although information could be transmitted through the spiritual connection, after the transmission, it might be millions of years later, or it might be the next moment. As for the specifics, it was not something that the current Luo fan could understand. Knowing this, Luo fan was even more convinced in his heart that the existence in front of him with 3 arms, 2 faces, and 6 fingers on each arm was related to a true saint. Only an existence like a true saint could completely construct a space-time dimension that completely belonged to him, even a space-time dimension of the same level as the perfect world at this time. The figure slowly opened its 4 tightly closed eyes. At this moment, an indescribable aura suddenly appeared on its body. Under this aura, the feeling that Luo fan's perception was gradually dissipating in the void completely disappeared. What replaced it was an inexplicable coolness. It was the kind of coolness that felt like a bucket of ice water had been poured on his head in the summer. This feeling made his perception become complete again and even caused the previously dissipated perception to condense again. That feeling was incomparably wonderful. At this time, the figure slowly extended the arm that grew out of its chest. Its 6 fingers clenched into a fist, and, as it closed slightly, it slowly pointed at Luo fan. At this point, Luo fan seemed to see the entire process of the birth, growth, prosperity, decline, and destruction of a perfect world in a trance. It was as if billions of trillions of years had flowed through his heart, but it was also as if this finger had not passed through any time at all. At the same time that the figure raised its hand, it was already pointing at him brazenly. Endless profundities and principles were compressed on that figure at this moment, making him seem as if he had become the grand Tao of this perfect world. He clearly knew that it was vast and profound, but he couldn't comprehend the true principles and profundities within it no matter how hard he tried. By the time Luo fan came back to his senses and roared, the figure had already disappeared without a trace. The surroundings had once again returned to the absolute void. That inexplicable structure had completely disappeared without a trace. Everything, as if the existence that Luo fan was familiar with and unfamiliar with previously did not exist at all. It was as if the figure that seemed to be some kind of existence that seemed to be a saint had never appeared. Immediately afterward, Luo fan felt that his surroundings were empty, and his perception had already returned to the outside of the fragment in a trance. What the hell happened just now? This thought flashed in Luo fan's mind. He carefully recalled that there seemed to be an endless number of things that had happened before. However, no matter how he thought about it and how he searched, he could not figure out what exactly had happened. It seems that the existence that I don't know whether it was the aura of a true saint or the shadow of a true saint pointed at me. Suddenly, Luo fan's expression changed slightly, and his expression became ugly. He no longer cared about anything else and began to thoroughly investigate his body, from every space-time within his body, all the way to the deepest part of his life source. In the end, he finally found a certain abnormality. A bit of a saint's imprint faintly appeared in the bottom of his heart. How is this possible? How can there be a saint's imprint? Where have I seen that true saint before? An indescribable feeling of horror welled up in Luo fan's heart. Back then, he had even taken the initiative to seize the existence of a saint's imprint. However, since he understood the mystery of the true saint's path, he had already sent it away. Moreover, because of this, he had even kowtowed to the 7 true sages and begged for their help. He had paid such a huge price to send it away, and now, unknowingly, another saint's imprint had appeared in the depths of his life source. How could he not be shocked? Why did it appear? Luo fan could not help but ask himself. Very soon, the figure pointed at him previously. It appeared in his memory as he thought about it, he realized that imprint seemed to have become slightly more solid. Damn it, even memories can strengthen this imprint. Luo Fan was even more shocked, and he hurriedly cut off his memory of that scene. At this moment, that imprint shook slightly, and an inexplicable message was transmitted out. It was an inexplicable mystery, and it was a kind of cultivation technique. This kind of cultivation technique was very profound. Its mysteriousness was even more complex and mysterious than Luo Fan's worldview. Luo Fan roughly looked at the cultivation technique and suddenly understood that it was a cultivation technique to enter the universe of negative emotions. That universe of negative emotions was indeed a real universe, a real heaven and earth. According to the level, it could indeed be called a big heaven and earth. However, the existence of this big heaven and earth was different from all other perfect heavens and earth. It was an invisible and limitless existence. This kind of existence made it so that any living beings who wanted to enter it did not need to cross the state of chaos, and they did not need to break through the heaven and earth that they were born in. They only needed to cultivate a specific cultivation technique and change the form of their existence. Of course, the cultivation technique that they needed to cultivate was not fixed. In fact, it was also an extremely complicated cultivation system. Some of the techniques were extremely simple, and some were extremely complicated. In the hands of Luo Fan, it was an extremely complicated cultivation technique. Change the nature of one's body. Luo Fan carefully studied the cultivation technique, and an inexplicable sneer suddenly appeared on his face. Changing the nature of one's body. This was something that only a living being who had no way out and had completely fallen into despair could do. After all, any cultivator who could cultivate to the point where they could come into contact with this kind of cultivation technique must have cultivated for countless years. They must have found their own path of cultivation, and they must have reached an extremely deep level in this path of cultivation. Under such circumstances, changing one's body was obviously equivalent to directly abandoning all of one's past achievements and the path of cultivation that one had found and cultivated for countless years. Why would anyone do this if they were not driven into a corner? As he sneered, Luo Fan casually threw the cultivation technique aside and turned his gaze to the brand. This brand must not be left behind. He had already made his decision when he found out that this was the mark of a saint. However, this was a saint's brand. Although the current Luo Fan was billions of times more powerful than when he had sent the saint's brand away, he was still far from a true saint. This saint's brand was still an almost unsolvable problem for him. If he wanted to send it away, it was obviously not something that could be done just by saying it. Countless thoughts, countless inspirations constantly appeared in his mind, but they were quickly eliminated and driven away by him. Just as he was constantly thinking, the saint's brand changed again. Another inexplicable message was transmitted through the brand. Luo Fan frowned and carefully sensed it. He found that the message contained another cultivation technique. It was a cultivation technique that could cultivate the two-faced, three-armed body. According to the description of the cultivation technique, once one cultivated this cultivation technique and changed their body into this appearance, they could directly, completely fuse with the chaotic spiritual treasure fragment. At that time, they would be able to turn the chaotic spiritual treasure fragment into their own body. In the end, they would be able to obtain the ability to live freely in the state of chaos without needing to prove the chaotic spiritual fruit. From then on, they would not be destroyed, and the world would decay, but they would not die. This, to a certain extent, it could be said that they had already become a true saint. Seeing this, Luo Fan's eyebrows twitched. He had to admit that for others, this was a great temptation. It was not a small temptation, although that kind of two-faced, three-armed figure was quite ugly in his eyes. However, for an existence like him, it was already a basic ability to transcend beauty and ugliness. Even if this kind of image was quite ugly, in order to be eternal, in order to not be shackled by any heaven and earth. Come to think of it, anyone would be able to accept it, but Luo Fan was obviously not others. For Luo Fan, Although becoming a true saint was still illusory, he was already on the right path. However, he was already on the right path, and the possibility of him becoming a true divine was many times higher than other experts. Moreover, if he wanted to live freely in the state of chaos, it was not that he had no way. Don't forget, he had a connate, inextinguishable spiritual light. With a connate, inextinguishable spiritual light, if the world was destroyed as long as he hid in it, he could easily isolate all the destruction of the outside world. At that time, waiting for the world to be reborn or entering the state of chaos was a good choice for him. Under such circumstances, why did he have to practice this kind of cultivation technique to change his nature? Why did he have to work so hard to integrate the fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure? In the end, it could completely cut off his path forward. With this kind of confidence, Luo Fan quickly put aside the cultivation technique that was given out by the imprint. However, at this time, he no longer thought about how to get rid of the imprint. Instead, he focused his attention on the surroundings of the imprint. He was not a rookie who had never seen a sage's imprint. He couldn't be any clearer about what a real saint's mark looked like. It was an extremely cold existence. Even if you forcefully provoked it, it would be indifferent to you. How could it take the initiative to reveal the cultivation technique? If it had revealed the cultivation technique related to the universe of negative emotions before, he could still treat it as the imprint because it was formed by a part of the structure related to the universe of negative emotions in the fragment. Although he had some doubts, he generally felt that it was normal. But now, it actually sent out another completely unrelated cultivation technique. No matter how he looked at it, it was not normal, right? "What the hell are you?" Luo Fan shouted coldly. This voice was completely absorbed into his origin of life, and it was compressed and reverberated around the imprint. If it was in the outside world, such a voice would have been enough to completely destroy thousands of vast thousand domains. Even though it was in the origin of life, it was enough to shake the origin of life around the imprint, which made Luo Fan feel extremely uncomfortable. Unfortunately, such a voice did not cause any changes to the imprint. The imprint acted as if the voice did not exist at all. No matter how it shook around it, it did not move at all. "Stop pretending. You're definitely not an ordinary sage's imprint. Can't you sense how many sage imprints there are in the depths of my origin of life?" Luo Fan said faintly. Like before, this voice was also transmitted into the origin of life, and it also began to shake the origin of life around the imprint. What he said was not a lie. Chapter 1735. Luo Fan waited for a long time, but no sound came from it, and no cultivation techniques flowed out like before. That mark seemed to be the mark of an ordinary saint, and it lay quietly in the depths of his life source. Looking at the brand, Luo Fan frowned. He couldn't be wrong. This brand was definitely not an ordinary saint's brand. There might even be something powerful hidden in it, and it might even be an existence with spiritual intelligence. Otherwise, it would not be so intelligent. However, looking at it now, that existence was not willing to pay any attention to him. It was obvious that that existence looked down on him and thought that there was nothing he could do about it. Luo Fan had already passed the age where he would lose his rationality and get angry when someone looked down on him. At this moment, he only frowned, but did not lose his rationality and do anything to the brand. "I must get this brand out." However, he had already made the most resolute decision in his heart. Back then, when he was still in such a weak realm, he was already determined to send the saint's brand away. Now that he was so much stronger than he was back then, how could he be willing to watch the brand exist in his life source? However, even though he had made up his mind, he still did not have much of an idea of what to do next. All kinds of ideas and inspirations kept appearing in his heart. Time gradually passed as he pondered. Suddenly, one day, Luo Fan suddenly felt an inexplicable pressure appear out of nowhere and directly press down on his body. It was as if he had become immortal at this moment, and an indescribable sense of powerlessness directly wrapped around him. "What is this?" His heart trembled, and he came back to his senses from that kind of thinking. The moment he came back to his senses, he he suddenly narrowed his eyes. His eyes suddenly narrowed. He had figured out what was going on in an instant. The catastrophe of the world is coming. This thought occupied his entire mind. Thinking of this, he suddenly raised his head to look at the sky. At this moment, however, the entire sky had already changed completely. The originally blue sky had turned blood red at this moment. It looked as if the entire sky had been completely covered by blood. Amidst the blood, one could faintly hear the cries of countless ghosts and gods. The might of it had even shocked Luo Fan's mind, making him feel as if there were countless people staring at him, ready to pounce on him at any moment and fight him to the death at any moment. Luo Fan had never encountered such a situation before. He thought about it for a while. Such a situation would only occur during the great tribulation of heaven and earth. At the same time, the crimson light surged, and an unprecedentedly powerful, ominous aura descended from the sky. In the blink of an eye, it had already enveloped the entire region, causing every living being in the region to feel a frenzy from the bottom of their hearts. In fact, everything in this world started to rapidly decay and perish under such changes. Originally, this world seemed to be in a state of time that could not be described by numbers, but now it had been completely replaced by an indescribable decay. It was as if the world was going to collapse in the next moment. It was as if the lifespan of this world had been compressed to an extremely short period of time. At this moment, a strange suction directly acted on Luo Fan's body. This suction was produced by the boundless, ominous aura. Moreover, the direction of its effect was directly on Luo Fan's spirit will. The strength of this suction had reached an unimaginable level. In the face of such a suction, Luo Fan vaguely felt as if he was facing a true sage. The feeling of facing the two-faced, three-armed, powerful existence that seemed to be the figure of a sage appeared in his heart again. Then he found that the world was spinning. He had already entered a strange place. There was a boundless sea of blood here. In this sea of blood, it contained countless unimaginable and terrifying things, and all kinds of terrifying existences that were beyond the imagination of living beings. Densely packed together, they appeared in this sea of blood. If an ordinary person entered this place, they might not be able to withstand the impact of this horror, and their spirit would collapse and die. Even existence like Luo Fan felt a terrifying shock at this moment. It constantly cooperated with the surrounding sea of blood, trying to pull him into the abyss of fear. This was not just the power of the sea of blood, but the power of the great calamity of heaven and earth. Fortunately, Luo Fan's mind had already completely merged with his worldview. As long as his worldview wasn't broken, his mind wouldn't be shaken in the slightest, and he wouldn't suffer any destructive damage. Therefore, at this moment, although the inside and outside of the sea of blood were constantly pressuring and shaking him, he was still unmoved by everything outside, and his spirit was still as stable as before. At this moment, in the sea of blood, an unknown number of living beings stepped out of the sea of blood one by one. These creatures all looked strange and strange. They had almost exhausted the limits of his imagination. However, every living being was extremely powerful in their own right. It felt like each of them could almost be compared to Luo Fan. There were so many of these terrifying living beings that it seemed like there was no end to them, and the pressure they brought was self-evident. Even Luo Fan couldn't help but feel an inexplicable sense of fear at this moment. He could already tell the nature of these living beings with a single glance. They were actually the endless incarnations of the living beings that had always existed in this world, and they were not born with Tao aptitude. It was the incarnation of all the living beings that existed in the imperfect era of the world's great calamity that was originally broken because of Luo Fan's actions. As for why they had become so powerful, it was naturally because these living beings had been filled with the power of the great calamity of heaven and earth, and they had been forcibly elevated to Luo Fan's level. At this moment, Luo Fan raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. In an instant, A three-legged cauldron broke through the gap between reality and illusion, and it directly appeared in front of him. This was his heavenly cauldron of the divine court. After Luo Fan's heavenly cauldron had been elevated to this level, in this world, it was almost a primordial origin spiritual treasure. Such an existence had many wonderful uses. It went without saying. It was easy to cross the gap between reality and illusion and enter this seemingly illusory world that only one's mind could enter from the real world. The moment the heavenly cauldron of the god court appeared, the boundless sea of blood began to churn. The shadow of the heavenly cauldron slowly formed in the sky above the sea of blood. Moreover, the blood-colored heavenly cauldron exuded an extremely astonishing aura at this moment. It faced the heavenly cauldron above Luo Fan's head from afar, and neither could overpower the other. After all, it's just an illusion. How can it compare to my real heavenly cauldron? Luo Fan looked disdainful at this scene. At first glance, the heavenly cauldron that had evolved seemed no different from the real heavenly cauldron, except for its color. But in fact, this heavenly cauldron was much weaker than the real heavenly cauldron. In a normal battle, his heavenly cauldron would definitely be able to destroy the blood-colored heavenly cauldron in just a few attacks. The reason was simple. Luo Fan's heavenly cauldron had already been blessed by the world. It even had the ability to evolve into a real, primordial origin spiritual treasure to attack. Such an existence, how could it be compared to the little changes in the tribulation of heaven and earth? At this moment, the endless, grotesque, horrifying creatures around them roared and pounced on Luo Fan. However, he had already let out an earth-shaking roar, wrapped in an incomparably terrifying aura, and directly pounced towards Luo Fan. Fortunately, this was a strange place created by the tribulation of heaven and earth, and not a normal space-time. Otherwise, even if this space-time was perfect, it would be mostly destroyed by this attack. In the face of such a terrifying attack, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. He raised his hand and pointed at the heavenly cauldron above him. In an instant, an astonishing suppressive force was emitted from the heavenly cauldron. In an instant, it spread across the boundless blood sea, causing all the grotesque creatures in the blood sea to freeze. Even all the other terrifying things stopped above the sea of blood at this moment. At this moment, the blood-colored heavenly cauldron on the opposite side also moved. A strange power was emitted from its body, and it rushed toward the heavenly cauldron above Luo Fan's head. Although this power was not a suppressive force, it was not weaker than the one emitted by the heavenly cauldron. In fact, it was even weaker. The imposing aura emitted from it made Luo Fan clearly understand that even if it was him, if he were to be hit by this force, his body would definitely collapse and be destroyed at this moment. The heavenly cauldron shook slightly and turned into a copper mirror. Shortly after, a strange light was emitted from the copper mirror. With a sweep, the terrifying energy that was charging towards it was already diverted to an unknown place. After that, the copper mirror emitted light again, traversing the void and arriving around the heavenly cauldron. It pressed down slightly, and the blood-colored heavenly cauldron was destroyed, turning into nothingness and disappearing without a trace. When the heavenly cauldron disappeared, the copper mirror shook again and emitted a strange light. However, this time, the light was directly cast into the blood sea below. In an instant, the light rushed into the blood sea, heading into the depths of the terrifying blood sea. The light was so bright, so dazzling, and its penetrative power was so terrifying. The blood sea seemed to turn transparent at the spot it passed through, allowing the light to penetrate through without any damage. The light kept going deeper and deeper. After an unknown amount of time, it seemed like an instant, but it also seemed like 1,000,000,000,000 years. The light finally came into contact with a physical existence. It was a strange mist that enveloped a humanoid figure, and the humanoid figure was none other than Luo Fan's body. At this moment, the light came into contact with the humanoid mist. In an instant, a strange, sizzling sound spread throughout the blood sea, causing Luo Fan's eardrums to vibrate slightly. With this sound, the mist gradually dissipated. Luo Fan, who was enveloped in the mist, gradually appeared as Luo Fan appeared. The boundless blood sea began to gradually turn into nothingness and eventually dissipated completely. Along with the blood sea that turned into nothingness and dissipated, the endless terror and creatures above the blood sea also dissipated. When everything disappeared, Luo Fan's heart moved, and he found that his soul had returned to his body. The heavenly cauldron had also returned to the top of his head. The first wave is over. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. This was the first wave of attack of the great tribulation of heaven and earth. Of course, this was only the first wave of attack aimed at him. Not all of the first wave of the great tribulation of heaven and earth would only attack him. Looking up, the entire world had been completely enveloped by the strange mist. All the creatures were wrapped in the mist, as if they had fallen into a deep sleep. From time to time, some creatures would vomit a mouthful of blood, and then their bodies would completely collapse. They would also turn into mist and blend into the surrounding mist. All traces of their existence would disappear without a trace. Among them, there was the false saint. Those who were in despair were not much different from ordinary people. At most, they could last a little longer, but they would collapse at the same rate as ordinary people and blend into the surrounding mist. As more and more creatures blended in, the mist became thicker and denser. In the end, it even turned into thick soil, directly covering the surface of the world, of course. It was not that all the creatures could not withstand it, but from time to time, some creatures would break free from the mist. They would directly repel the surrounding mist, causing a certain range of emptiness around their bodies. This caused the area around his body to be empty, and no smoke would be able to invade the area. Almost all of the emperors were able to do this. Only one or two emperors, for some reason, couldn't withstand the smoke and spat out blood before disintegrating into the surrounding smoke. Seeing this, Luo Fan sighed slightly. I didn't expect there to be such a big flaw in the hearts of the supreme emperors. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan sighed slightly. I never thought that there would be such a big flaw in the heart of supreme emperor. Seeing this, Luo Fan sighed slightly. I didn't expect there to be such a big flaw in the hearts of the supreme emperors. No matter how strong one's strength was, it would not have much of an advantage against that kind of impact. Only when one's spirit was strong enough could one withstand that kind of impact. Those supreme emperors could not withstand the impact, obviously because there was a huge flaw in their spirit, which was caught by the great tribulation of heaven and earth. It was precisely because he knew this that Luo Fan said these words at this time. It's a pity that we're missing a few more. At this time, a sigh resounded in Luo Fan's ears. It was the voice of the Realm Emperor. Luo Fan did not look for the Realm Emperor. He only smiled and said, "Are you not going to use your preparation?" Hearing this, the Realm Emperor said, "I'm about to use it, but I need your help." Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "What can I do? It's my duty." At this time, the Realm Emperor seemed to heave a sigh of relief and said, "With your words, it's a done deal." Luo Fan did not waste any more time. With a thought, he took a step forward and his figure crossed through space-time, arriving at the Realm Emperor's abode. Although the world was filled with the indescribable murderous aura, it was an absolute existence to ordinary creatures. It would completely restrict their control and change of space-time. However, for an existence like Luo Fan, this was naturally nothing at all. When he arrived, he saw a huge bronze mirror in front of the Realm Emperor's abode. This bronze mirror was naturally very different from the chaotic origin spiritual treasure that Luo Fan had evolved with a part of the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light. There were countless dense patterns engraved on the bronze mirror, and there was a pitch-black and unfathomable shadow on the front. It did not look like a mirror that could reflect people at all. Instead, it looked like a world passage that led to a mirror world. At this time, the Realm Emperor, he floated quietly under the mirror. At this time, his eyes reflected the tragic scene of the entire world as he looked at the false sages. One by one, the desperate earth exploded and turned into a part of the smoke. On the contrary, it strengthened the power of the great tribulation of heaven and earth. However, his expression was extremely solemn. Seeing that Luo Fan had arrived, the Realm Emperor said to Luo Fan, "I still have to rely on you to activate this artifact." Luo Fan did not ask much. He smiled and said, "Then let's begin." As he spoke, he also arrived under the mirror. As for how to activate a pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure, this was not a problem at all for Luo Fan. He only needed to see that magic weapon. As long as he saw the artifact, he would naturally know what to do. As for whether the Realm Emperor would plot against him or use any means to deal with him, he was not worried at all. With the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light, even if the Realm Emperor used the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light to plot against him, he would at most be slightly injured. He would not die because of it. Could the Realm Emperor use a more advanced method than the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light to deal with him? That was obviously impossible. Under such circumstances, what did he have to worry about? What was there to doubt? The two of them were level 3 emperors, so they naturally had a tacit understanding with each other. They each chose a corresponding opportunity and poured their power into the bronze mirror above them. At that moment, the bronze mirror received the help of their power. It suddenly came to life. The countless patterns on the mirror began to tremble and gradually emit light. A buzzing sound kept coming from it, spreading to every inch of the void in the entire world. This caused all living beings in the world to be able to hear this voice in an instant. This sound had an indescribable penetrating power and had all sorts of incredible effects. The spirits of the living beings who heard this voice instantly became much more resolute. Countless billions of living beings even broke through the world that could only be entered with their minds and directly escaped, avoiding the fate of turning into smoke and fusing with the surrounding smoke. However, this was clearly not the bronze mirror's greatest use. At this moment, the buzzing sound coming from the copper mirror grew louder and louder, and the bronze mirror also began to gradually expand. Not long after, it had already grown to a diameter of tens of thousands of miles. It stood between the heavens and the earth like an indomitable wall. Following this change, the black shadow on the surface of the mirror began to rotate slowly. The speed of the rotation became faster and faster, eventually turning into a vortex that produced an unimaginable suction force. It began to frantically absorb the endless smoke in the surroundings, causing the smoke to be sucked into the mirror. The suction force became stronger and stronger as time passed, and the speed at which the smoke was sucked into the mirror also increased. In the end, an unknown number of tornadoes were generated in front of the mirror. They poured into the mirror from all directions, causing the vortex in the mirror to grow larger and larger, and the mirror to grow larger and larger. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that the mirror's absorption of power had become even stronger. Fortunately, he was a rank 3 monarch, so the speed and amount of power generated in his body had reached an unimaginable level. That was why he was able to easily withstand the terrifying absorption force, allowing the mirror to continue changing without any serious consequences due to a lack of power. At this moment, the World King clearly wasn't relaxed either. Although his expression didn't change much, the solemnity in his eyes became more and more profound. Daoist friend, you really have a good method to use this power to refine this magic treasure. After this wave of tribulations is over, this magic treasure will probably be upgraded by a level. Luo Fan sighed. How can upgrading by a level be so simple? The material of this magic treasure is simply not enough to support this kind of upgrade. In fact, I have already planned to give up on this magic treasure. The World King just sighed helplessly. Give up. Luo Fan only smiled faintly. He didn't really believe this. What was material to an existence that could create things at will? If the World King was willing, as long as he changed the absorbed power, the corresponding material would naturally be born and integrated into the magic treasure. Chapter 1736. However, since the World Emperor did not want to say it, or it was difficult for him to say it, he did not care anymore. At this moment, the black vortex in front of the huge mirror was like a real black hole. It sucked in all the smoke in the world, causing the smoke in the surrounding space-time to become thinner and thinner. However, it was obvious that this world was too vast and boundless. Even if it was absorbing like a black hole, even if the absorption strength had surpassed space-time and directly affected all the smoke in the world, it was clearly not easy to absorb all the smoke. According to Luo Fan's current calculations, it would take at least 1,000 years for the black hole in the mirror to completely absorb the endless smoke that existed in this entire world. Obviously, the World King had expected this. At this moment, there was a hint of annoyance on his face, as if he was displeased that the speed of development was too slow. However, Luo Fan did not care about this. He only poured his power into the mirror. Suddenly, his heart moved. He was curious about the changes in the underworld. As soon as he thought about it, his eyes had already penetrated all obstructions and shone into the underworld. He saw all the changes that were happening in the underworld. At this moment, the entire underworld was also enveloped by the endless smoke. However, there were no living beings or spirits in the smoke. Not even Gui Shou, Qing Yi, and Yu Ji could be seen. At this moment, it had completely disappeared and no longer existed in the underworld earth. Or rather, they no longer existed in the smoke. This situation clearly showed that the smoke did not just send their souls to that strange place. Instead, it directly sent their bodies to that strange place. This matter was originally extremely inconceivable, but Luo Fan's thoughts turned a little, and he already understood what was going on. It must be known that the underworld was the residence of spirits and spirits. The rules, laws, and the great Tao would definitely change in response to this. Under such circumstances, the various changes in the smoke would naturally be affected by the underworld. Naturally, he would be affected by the underworld earth and turn into what he was now. He didn't just send his mind to that strange place. Instead, he directly sent his body, his soul, and his soul into it. This situation was a good thing for all living beings in the underworld. Spiritual attacks could only be resisted with one spirit, and the soul. There was no direct correlation between strength and strength. Perhaps some experts were powerful, but their minds were not invulnerable. In that case, it might completely collapse under the impact and eventually die. On the other hand, there were some creatures who might not be strong enough themselves, but their minds were already perfect and flawless, so they were instead able to break free from that kind of impact. But now he had transferred his entire body, his entire soul, and even his entire soul into his body. That would change the nature of the situation. In that case, it would be able to withstand the impact. It was no longer just the soul. It contained many more things. For example, strength and fleshly body. In this way, it would naturally be easier to resist, and the possibility of breaking through would naturally be greater. After understanding this, Luo Fan couldn't help but feel relieved. If it was purely based on the soul, Gui Shou and the others might not have absolute confidence that they could withstand it. However, with their strength and their bodies, the situation was obviously different. Just as Luo Fan was thinking about this, the smoke in the center of the underworld shook, and suddenly, a gap appeared out of thin air. There was a figure within the gap, materializing from illusory to corporeal. This figure was Gui Shou. From the looks of it, it was obvious that Gui Shou had already withstood that kind of impact, and he had already passed the first wave of the great tribulation of heaven and earth. Not long after Gui Shou appeared, not far away from him, Qing Yi and Yu Ji pushed away the smoke almost at the same time, creating an empty area without smoke. Then, their figures also materialized and appeared there. Seeing that the three of them were fine, Luo Fan nodded to himself. The appearance of the three of them seemed to be a signal. Then, more and more creatures materialized and appeared in various space-times in the underworld. The number of spirits in the underworld was thousands or even tens of thousands of times more than in the Yang realm. Such densely packed spirits constantly emerged and continuously dissipated the smoke. This made the speed at which the smoke in the underworld became thicker was not obvious. It was as if the rate of their recovery and the rate of their death were equal. As more and more creatures emerged from that state, there was more and more vitality in the underworld. Looking at the changed appearance of the underworld in front of him, Guaisho's eyes were filled with resentment. With a thought, as his power surged, the phantoms of the Book of Life and Death and the judge's brush appeared behind his head. After these two phantoms appeared, the phantoms of the Book of Life and Death slowly flipped open, and the phantoms of the judge's brush began to slowly sketch on the Book of Life and Death. The speed of the sketch was extremely fast, and it was extremely complicated. In almost a breath's time, it had drawn hundreds of millions of strokes as they sketched. The Book of Life and Death and the judge's brush seemed to have turned into two black holes. They began to frantically absorb the endless smoke around them, causing the place where the three of them were to turn into a huge whirlpool. It stirred the endless smoke in the underworld, causing the smoke to gradually revolve along with the whirlpool. As time passed, the smoke became thinner and thinner. This change caused the creatures of the underworld, who had passed the danger of the impact, to turn from the void into reality at an even faster speed. They broke free from that inexplicable state, causing the smoke to slowly surge and change. This effect was similar to what Luo Fan and the World King were doing. However, compared to Luo Fan and the World King, who were doing it as if it was easy, at this moment, Guaisho's face was filled with difficulty. Moreover, as he struggled, a hint of irritation appeared in his eyes. This irritation. It was different from the irritation in the World King's heart. The World King needed too much time to deal with the smoke. It was a kind of irritation on the surface. However, his heart would not change because of this. Guaisho was different. His irritation seemed to erupt from the bottom of his heart. It was a kind of irritation that seemed to erupt from the deepest part of his being affected by some inexplicable external force. This scene was seen by Luo Fan. The moment he saw this scene, a light flashed in Luo Fan's mind. He already understood why the World King intended to give up on the copper mirror that he was using. This smoke that filled the entire world was an extremely mysterious, evil aura. This kind of evil aura. It could pull the souls of creatures into a strange place to attack. It obviously had a great negative effect on the soul. Under this negative effect, even if it was in existence like the World King, if he endured too much, it would definitely affect his soul. In the end, he would become a part of the calamity of this world. Under such circumstances, if the realm monarch didn't give up on this magic treasure and continue to increase the power of this magic treasure, then in the end, his soul might be directly affected by the boundless, baleful aura within it. In the end, even if it didn't become a part of the great tribulation of the heavens and earth, it would still not be able to stop the great tribulation of heaven and earth. It would not benefit him. After understanding this, he could not help but sigh. With a thought, a doppelganger directly separated the yin and yang, rushed into the underworld earth, and came to Guaisho. At this time, Guaisho was shocked to see Luo Fan. Luo Fan did not wait for him to say anything and said, "Why don't you stop? Do you want to become a part of this world's calamity? Become a part of this world's calamity." Guaisho's heart trembled, and his face was filled with horror. He was also a second-level emperor. Before Luo Fan said it, he did not think about it at all. Naturally, he did not know what would happen. But now, after hearing Luo Fan's words, he had countless inspirations. Suddenly, he understood what was going on. With the power of the Book of Life and Death and the judge's brush, he could absorb the evil aura. But the Book of Life and Death and the judge's brush had formed a certain degree of integration with him. When the evil aura was integrated into the Book of Life and Death and the judge's brush, it was equivalent to being integrated into his body. It was fine if there was only a small amount of it, but if there was a large amount, then he would definitely be distorted by the baleful aura. At that time, he would only be able to act according to the nature of the baleful aura, and he would no longer have his own thoughts and actions. Wouldn't he become a tool of this world's calamity, a part of it? After understanding this, How could he dare to be careless? With a thought, he instantly stopped the Book of Life and Death and the judge's brush from absorbing the evil aura. However, the situation did not go as he wished at all. He stopped activating the phantom of the Book of Life and Death and the judge's brush to make the suction disappear. But the evil aura and the smoke did not stop surging toward them. There was still an endless baleful aura and endless mist that came from all directions. It surged out from the space-time of the nether earth and frantically charged towards the two of them, fusing with them. Although the speed was much slower than when the Gui show took the initiative to absorb the evil aura, it was still continuous and could not be stopped. "Oh no, I can't stop it at all." The Gui show was horrified and shouted. At this time, Luo Fan frowned deeply, but he sighed in his heart. As expected, it's not that simple. The world's calamity was a kind of horrible calamity that could completely destroy a perfect world. Such a calamity, of course, could not be a dead thing, and it could not be carried out according to a fixed procedure. Such a horrible calamity must be controlled by a kind of intelligence similar to the world's will. How could the world let go of this evil aura when it knew that a powerful force would join its side and a powerful existence would help it to impose a calamity on this world? The Gui show wanted to cut off the evil aura? How is that possible? All kinds of thoughts flashed in his mind, and Luo Fan's heart moved. The clone raised his hand and slowly pressed toward the phantom of the Book of Life and Death and the judge's brush. This move of his contained his strongest understanding, the profound mysteries of the innate, inextinguishable spirit light. It contained all kinds of comprehension from the primordial spiritual treasure fragment. Its power was so strong that even an existence like the World Emperor could not withstand it. If he was pressed like this, his body would inevitably collapse, and he would have to return to the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light to be reborn. Now, this move directly pressed on the phantom of the Book of Life and Death and the judge's brush. In an instant, the two of them shook violently. Rumble, rumble, after two earth-shattering thunderclaps, two powerful shock waves gushed out from the phantom of the Book of Life and Death and the judge's brush. They instantly swept through all the space-time in the underworld, causing the space-time to shake violently at this moment. If it wasn't for the fact that the underworld was incomparably tough and had an extremely strong ability to withstand the impact. At this time, this kind of change was enough to destroy thousands of space-time in the underworld. Although the target of Luo Fan's attack was the phantom of the Book of Life and Death and the judge's brush, these two were obviously closely related to the Gui show. However, these two were obviously closely related to Gui show. At the instant the impact was born, Gui show's face turned pale, and then blood gushed out from every single pore on his body. It was as if Sun Jian's entire body had been shattered into countless tiny pieces and was only barely maintaining that silhouette. It actually doesn't work? Luo Fan frowned at this time. Although the scene of him pressing down was incomparably shocking and astonishing, it was incomparably shocking. He could clearly feel that the Book of Life and Death and the judge's brush were still in his hands. These two, although they collapsed just now, they quickly condensed again and completely recovered in the blink of an eye. As for the injuries on the Gui show's body, he wasn't worried at all. It should be known that the Gui show could be considered to be conceptually immortal now. Even if his entire body was completely crushed and destroyed, as long as the concept of his existence was not completely destroyed, he would naturally be reborn after a certain period of time. He would naturally be reborn after a certain period of time and would not truly die. Not to mention, at this time, he was only bleeding from all the pores all over his body. That body, that spirit, that life source, they were all still intact. The shock wave gradually dispersed, and the Gui show's figure appeared again in front of everyone. Now, he was exactly the same as before. It seemed that the previous wave of terrifying shock wave had never appeared. He was still floating there, and the phantom of the Book of Life and Death and the judge's brush were still floating behind his head. They were also constantly absorbing the endless murderous aura around. Noticing this scene, Both the Gue Shou and Qingyi Yuji were shocked. "Master, what should we do?" The Gue Shou was shocked. Luo Fan frowned and said, "I didn't expect it to be so powerful. It seems that I have to go all out. However, you have to be mentally prepared. If I go all out, I'm afraid that you will have to abandon this body of yours. As long as I can get out of here, it doesn't matter if I abandon this body." The Gue Shou said directly. Abandoning his body, as long as he controlled it well, was not a big deal for the current Gue Shou. He could almost recover in the next moment, so he naturally wouldn't worry about it. Luo Fan didn't say much. He raised his hand and waved. The divine court heavenly cauldron in his body slightly trembled. It had already broken the yin and yang separation, directly came to the underworld, and appeared in front of him. He stretched out his hand and grabbed the divine court heavenly cauldron. Then, the divine court heavenly cauldron began to gradually change from a three-legged cauldron to an extremely wonderful gourd, quietly lying on his palm. After the appearance of this gourd, the surrounding evil chi seemed to be inexplicably stimulated and began to vibrate rapidly. Gue Shou and the others instantly sensed an indescribably terrifying pressure coming from the gourd, oppressing their bodies, oppressing their souls, and oppressing the essence of their lives. At this moment, all of them felt an indescribable terror rising from the bottom of their hearts. At this moment, all three of them understood. This was a powerful magic treasure that far exceeded their understanding. After understanding this, an inexplicable kind of expectation surged in their hearts. Such a terrifying magic treasure. It would certainly be able to destroy the phantoms of the two magic treasures. At this moment, Luo Fan didn't care about the surrounding evil chi, nor did he care about the Gue Shou and the others at this moment. With a thought, he poured a divine light into the gourd. In an instant, a ray of light shot out from the mouth of the gourd. This ray of light was so mysterious and profound. After it appeared, it directly condensed into a ball, emitting a feeling that it could destroy everything and yet contain everything. The moment this ball of light appeared, the entire underworld seemed to tremble slightly. It was as if the underworld couldn't withstand this ball of light. The endless space-time trembled violently. The countless creatures that had just escaped from the evil chi all felt an intense fear rising from the bottom of their hearts at this moment. The evil chi's change was even greater. It was as if there was a natural enemy of the baleful aura here. The baleful aura began to surge wildly in all directions, opening up more and more space in this area, causing an increasingly large area of pure void to appear around the ball of light. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone felt extremely strained. After the gourd released the ball of light, it seemed as if it had released all of its power. There were faint signs that it was about to collapse. In order to maintain the gourd, Luo Fan had to expend almost all of his strength. In order to maintain the ball of light, he had to expend almost all of his strength. At this moment, his body was trembling slightly. "I can't wait any longer." Such a thought flashed through his mind. With this thought, he said to Gue Shou, "Get ready." After saying that, he reluctantly paused for a moment before activating the gourd. The ball of light trembled slightly, and it had already charged straight at the Book of Life and Death and the judge's brush behind Gue Shou's head. At this moment, Gue Shou felt an indescribable fear rising from the bottom of his heart. An incomparably strong desire to escape constantly surged in his heart, urging him to dodge as fast as possible. If he didn't remember what Luo Fan had said before, Gue Shou would have already dodged at this moment. At this moment, under this urge from the bottom of his heart, Gue Shou was afraid that he would have already dodged, but at this moment, he could only grit his teeth. He forcibly resisted the urge from the bottom of his heart, as if he had been standing there since ancient times. He forcibly stopped moving. Although there were countless thoughts in his heart, in fact, the ball of light transcended space-time. When it left the gourd's mouth, it had already arrived at the Book of Life and Death and the judge's brush's shadows. With a brazen explosion, the Book of Life and Death and the judge's brush's shadows silently disappeared without a trace. At the same time, Guizhou only felt a terrifying power sweeping through his body. Then, like a snowman under the sun, his body gradually melted. In a short while, he had completely disappeared, as if he had never appeared in the first place. Guizhou, Qing Yi and Yu Ji's pupils shrank, and they couldn't help but exclaim. But very quickly, they recalled what Luo Fan had said before, and they couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief. Although they had always had a somewhat competitive relationship with Guizhou, and they were usually rather jealous and envious of Guizhou's luck, after spending so many years together, the three of them had already accumulated an extremely deep friendship. Although it wasn't a romantic relationship, they could be considered as close friends. Under such circumstances, seeing Guizhou suddenly disappear in front of them, it would be strange if they weren't shocked. Seems like it's a success. Luo Fan carefully sensed and let out a long breath. At this moment, the gourd in his hand shook slightly, and in a blur, it had already turned back into the divine court heavenly cauldron. And within it, the 20 worlds within the formation had become broken again, and it would take several years for them to recover. As he sighed in his heart, the void trembled slightly. As the boundless power gathered, a figure gradually appeared in front of him. It was Guizhou, who had been resurrected. Chapter 1737. Thank you, Master, for saving my life. The Guizhou bowed at Luo Fan. His words were filled with sincere gratitude. Although Luo Fan had only saved him from being attacked by the murderous aura and the fate of becoming a part of the tribulation of heaven and earth, it did not seem like he had saved his life. However, one should not forget what it meant to be a part of the tribulation of heaven and earth. To be a part of the tribulation of heaven and earth meant that one would become the enemy of heaven and earth. It meant that one would become the enemy of the countless cultivators and living beings in this world. The possibility of failure was extremely high. Once he failed, he would naturally lose his life. Not to mention, even if he succeeded, this world would be completely destroyed. At that time, as an existence that was not a true divine, he would not be able to survive in the state of chaos. He would completely perish as soon as the world was destroyed. That was also death. Therefore, it could be said that if the Guizhou really became a part of the tribulation of heaven and earth, then no matter what, death was the only possibility for him. In this way, Luo Fan saved him from this fate, which was equivalent to saving his life. Luo Fan only faintly smiled and said, "Have you fully recovered from your injuries?" "I'm fine now," the Guizhou hurriedly replied. Although he had been resurrected, the attack that Luo Fan had unleashed earlier was too powerful and mysterious. Even though he had been reborn, there were still some injuries left in his body and mind. At this moment, they were still constantly destroying his body and mind, preventing him from returning to his peak state. However, this only affected his ability to unleash his strength. As for his life, it did not have much of an impact. Because of this, that was why it could be said that he was fine. Hearing this, Luo Fan nodded and said, "Next, you just have to protect yourself first. It is not suitable for you to participate in the first wave of the tribulation." The Guizhou nodded. "I will listen to Master's teachings." Luo Fan nodded and turned around to look at Qing, Yi, and Yu Ji. Seeing this, the two of them hurriedly nodded and said, "We will not participate either." "That's good." Luo Fan smiled faintly and did not say anything else. His figure flickered, and he left the underworld and returned to his original body. He returned to his main body. The heavenly cauldron of the divine court also returned to its original position. "Dao friend, you really have a good plan. No wonder you didn't say anything before." After the avatar returned, Luo Fan turned his head and said to the world emperor helplessly. Hearing this, the realm king knew what he meant. He smiled and said, "I don't doubt that you will soon find out why I didn't tell you." Hearing this, Luo Fan could only smile bitterly. Naturally, he already knew what was going on. This magic treasure actually had the same effect as the phantom of the Book of Life and Death and the judge's brush that Guizhou had displayed before. Under normal circumstances, at this moment, not only the world emperor, but even Luo Fan himself had the possibility of falling into the same danger as the turtle lifespan. The reason why he did not fall into that kind of situation. The reason was very simple. It was because the tribulation of the heavens and the earth hadn't noticed this. However, this was only an extremely fragile state. With the mysteriousness of the heavens and the earth tribulation, as long as Luo Fan or the World Emperor said anything about falling into the heavens, and the tribulation would naturally be triggered. At that time, it would naturally strengthen the connection between them and the magic treasure, directly turning them into a part of the heavens and earth tribulation. It was also because he knew this clearly. The World Emperor didn't explain just now. Luo Fan also thought of it when the turtle lifespan fell into that kind of predicament. The reason why the turtle lifespan fell into that kind of predicament without saying anything was very simple. Because the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush had actually fused with him. That kind of connection wasn't comparable to the connection between the World Emperor and Luo Fan and the magic treasure. After knowing this, Luo Fan naturally fell into silence. He only focused on controlling the magic treasure, causing the suction of the vortex in the magic treasure to become more and more astonishing. However, because he recognized this danger, Luo Fan raised his vigilance to the highest at this moment, and he was ready to cut off this connection at any moment. Compared to dealing with this tribulation, he was more concerned about himself. Time slowly flowed, and in the blink of an eye, 100 years had passed. After 100 years of absorption, the ominous aura between heaven and earth had become unbelievably thin, to the point where one could even overlook the existence of the ominous aura if they weren't careful. At this moment, the world had become lively again. The number of living beings that had escaped from that inexplicable impact had reached a full 60%, although there were still billions of living beings that died in that tribulation. It was unavoidable. After all, this was a terrifying tribulation that targeted all living beings. If it weren't for Luo Fan and the World Emperor frantically controlling the magic treasure and absorbing the ominous aura, perhaps 40 to 50% of the remaining 60% of living beings would have died in this tribulation. Among these surviving living beings, although the survival rate of the false saints and despair was slightly higher than that of ordinary living beings, it was only 10 to 20% higher. However, there were still 20 to 30% of the false saints and despair who died in the first wave of the tribulation. One day after this 100 years, Luo Fan suddenly felt an inexplicable sense of danger surging in his heart, and his entire body trembled slightly at this moment. **T. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. After this thought, he quickly cut off the connection between himself and the bronze mirror-like magic treasure, and the power that was constantly pouring into it to activate this magic treasure was instantly cut off. At the same time, the World Emperor also cut off the connection with the magic treasure and stopped pouring power into it. When he realized that Luo Fan was the same as him, he turned around and smiled at Luo Fan. "Fellow Taoist, your reaction is really fast. I was going to remind you before." Luo Fan only smiled bitterly. If he had waited for the World Emperor to remind him, he would have long been devoured by the changes in this magic treasure. How could he make it in time? However, he didn't take it to heart. After all, the situation just now was urgent. Everyone would take care of themselves first before anything else at that moment. He said, "Now isn't the time to talk about this. Fellow Taoist, how do you think we should deal with this magic treasure in front of us?" At this moment, the magic treasure that had broken free from the control of Luo Fan and the World Emperor was already trembling slightly, and an increasingly powerful aura began to emit from this magic treasure. And in this aura, there was an indescribable aura of evil chi. It was as if this was not a magic treasure that absorbed evil chi, but the materialization of evil chi, the condensation of evil chi. In the face of such a situation, there was only an inexplicable expression on Luo Fan's face. And the World Emperor, at this time, there was a kind of relaxed expression on his face. He said, "I have already expected this kind of situation. At the beginning, there was already a huge flaw in this magic treasure. What we need to do now is to attack its flaw." At that time, This magic treasure will naturally be destroyed, and it will naturally disappear. Hearing this, Luo Fan couldn't help but secretly relax. Leaving a flaw, he could rest assured. Although this magic treasure was now at the level of a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. No matter how big the flaw left behind was, for a magic treasure, it would not be fatal, even if it was a fatal flaw left at the beginning. After it grew and evolved, it would naturally be remedied, and it would no longer be fatal. But as long as it was a flaw, it could be used. No matter what kind of flaw it was, compared to other places, other directions, and other methods. They were bound to be weaker. Attacking from this angle, attacking from this direction was bound to be many times better than other positions. At this time, an inexplicable message accompanied the words of the World Emperor into Luo Fan's heart. In a flash, he understood where the flaw of the magic treasure was sensing the flaw. Luo Fan suddenly understood how to attack. At that moment, he smiled slightly, and without hesitation, he raised his hand and pressed down on a certain position behind the magic treasure. At the same time, the World Emperor also made a move, pressing down on the back of the magic treasure. However, compared to Luo Fan, the position he pressed was a little different. There was a very subtle connection between the two positions, so that the combination of the two was enough to produce an incredible kind of destruction. Rumble. The two forces blasted on the two positions behind the bronze mirror. In an instant, the bronze mirror began to tremble slightly, and its originally frantically rising aura and rapidly evolving state were instantly broken. Countless small cracks began to spread in all directions from the two positions. At first, there wasn't much connection between the two positions. The cracks on the two sides were also independent, and there wasn't much communication between them. But as time passed, the cracks on the two sides began to quickly connect and began to spread in all directions like an explosion. In the end, it continued to expand and accelerate, and in the end, it traversed the entire magic treasure, making it look like countless fragments were forcefully glued together. During this process, an absolute annihilation came from between the two positions, flowed through the entire magic treasure along the countless cracks, and finally deeply engraved itself in the depths of the magic treasure, causing the magic treasure's interior to begin to decay and the magic treasure's aura to begin to rapidly weaken. At this time, Luo Fan and the World Emperor both withdrew their palms. At this time, the World Emperor raised his hand, and as boundless spiritual light surged, a huge array directly enveloped the mirror. Following that, an earth-shattering impact erupted from the mirror. Under this impact, the array that the World Emperor had just constructed instantly had countless cracks. These cracks densely covered the formation, making it seem as if the formation had already been destroyed, as if it had completely lost its power. But this was only what it looked like. In the end, the array still withstood the impact. Although the impact caused cracks to appear on it and caused its shape to change, in the end, the array still managed to compress all the shockwaves within. And in the midst of the impact, the mirror within the array. The mirror, which had already been filled with countless cracks and extermination, had completely shattered. It turned into the finest smoke and dust, and the shockwaves reverberated within the array. That kind of annihilation. This was the strongest concept of annihilation that the World Emperor himself could produce. It was the strongest concept of annihilation that had been planted in the mirror. The destructive effect of such an annihilation was beyond imagination, whether it was power, matter, or even time and space. Under this kind of annihilation, they simply couldn't resist at all. In the end, they were all devoured and gradually died. By the time everything calmed down, the array had already turned into nothingness. There wasn't even time and space left. Even the layer of laws and laws had completely disappeared into nothingness. Countless cracks had even appeared behind the void, causing the grand Tao in the unseen world to reveal a trace of it. Looking at this, the World Emperor sighed. Finally, the first wave of calamity has been dealt with. As he spoke, he casually dispersed the array that he had just set up before him. There were already countless cracks on the array, as though it was about to collapse. After this array disappeared, the surrounding endless laws and laws began to surge rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it had already filled up the nothingness. Then, above the layer of laws and laws, space-time was constructed. In the blink of an eye, it had already turned into normal space-time, as though nothing had happened before. At this moment, there was still a faint, baleful aura in the entire world. This was something that was inevitably brought about by this great calamity. As long as this great calamity didn't subside, this baleful aura wouldn't disappear. No matter what method any person or expert used, they couldn't change this fact. However, since the first wave of calamity had been dealt with, although these tribulations still existed, they could no longer pull the numerous living beings into the spiritual world. This world had finally shown its rare peace since the beginning of this great calamity 100 years ago. However, it was obvious that this peace wouldn't last long in the midst of this great calamity. As time passed, the pressure that existed in this world grew stronger and more terrifying. And the baleful aura that was originally so weak that it couldn't be detected began to grow even denser at this moment. However, in the process of this baleful aura becoming denser, its nature was also gradually changing. From the state that originally pulled the living beings into that indescribable world, it transformed into a state that possessed powerful destructive power. Everything in this world seemed to be gradually corroded by this baleful aura. Whether it was the layer of laws and laws, the sky above, or the great Tao at a deeper level, it was like metal that had encountered concentrated sulfuric acid. More and more traces of corrosion gradually appeared. The entire scene was filled with boundless despair. The living beings that had just escaped from the first wave of calamity felt their hearts sink once more. Moreover, they felt even more despair than before. Direct corrosion. Luo Fan couldn't help but smile bitterly when he saw this. This was something that he hadn't expected. It went without saying how powerful this baleful aura was to be able to corrode the layer of laws and the great Tao of this world. It should be noted that given the state of this world, even if Luo Fan wanted to shatter the layer of laws and laws, he would need to expend a lot of energy. It was simply impossible to shake the great Tao of this world. However, under such circumstances, this great calamity was actually able to do this with just this baleful aura. With a thought, Luo Fan turned to the Realm King and asked, "What do you plan to do, Taoist?" The Realm King smiled bitterly and said, "You must be joking, Taoist. Being able to predict the first wave of calamity is already an extraordinary feat on my part. How would I know how to break through the second wave of calamity?" At this moment, figures arrived one after another and appeared next to Luo Fan and the Realm King. They were all supreme sovereigns. After appearing here, these supreme sovereigns all looked panicked and asked the Realm King how they should deal with this wave of calamity. The calamity before them was the most troublesome one. If this baleful aura's corrosion was concentrated in one place, it would be 1,000,000 times stronger. These supreme sovereigns had ways to deal with it. However, it had spread out and completely enveloped the entire world, pouring mercury on the ground. It attacked everything in a pervasive manner, leaving them at a loss as to what to do. At this moment in the underworld, an inexplicable vibration spread out. Amidst the vibration, an inexplicable light slowly seeped out. It directly entered the world of the Yang and entered the eyes of Luo Fan and the others. "This is?" the Realm King asked with a frown. At this moment, all the supreme sovereigns turned their gazes to the underworld. At this moment, they saw a change that made them overjoyed. This was because the countless space-time in the underworld was currently emitting inexplicable light. This light intertwined and condensed into the book of life and death and the magistrate's brush in the void. With an overwhelming momentum, they enveloped the entire underworld, placing the boundless space-time in the underworld under their protection. The vibration from the underworld was caused by the impact of the baleful aura on the book of life and death and the magistrate's brush. The light that seeped out of the underworld was also produced by the collision between the baleful aura and the Book of Life and Death and the Magistrate's brush. Under the resistance of the Book of Life and Death and the Magistrate's brush, the baleful aura couldn't enter the underworld at all. As a result, the space-time, laws, and even the grand Tao of the underworld weren't corroded by the baleful aura at all. At this moment, the world of the Yang was already severely damaged, but the underworld was still unharmed. There's a way. At this time, Luo Fan and the World King said in unison. After the two spoke, the other supreme sovereigns were pleasantly surprised. The two of them were the strongest supreme sovereigns in the world. Since the two of them spoke at the same time, their credibility was extremely high. It was enough to give them a lot of hope at this time. "Fellow Taoist, please speak," Luo Fan said calmly. His method was based on the Book of Life and Death and the Magistrate's brush in the underworld. The Realm King, who also had an idea after seeing the Book of Life and Death and the Magistrate's brush, assumed that his method wouldn't be too different. The Realm King didn't decline. He nodded and said, "These two treasures are treasures condensed from the world. In other words, they're materialized from the power of the underworld itself. We only need to be able to condense the power of the world of the Yang. Once they materialize, they will naturally be able to resist the erosion of this kind of baleful aura." Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled faintly. His thoughts were the same as well. Although the method is good, isn't it too late now? After all, the world is now constantly being eroded by the tribulations. I'm afraid it's too late to condense power and materialize treasures. A level 3 sovereign's clone said. Of course not. Fellow Taoists, have you all forgotten how the Book of Life and Death and the Magistrate's brush were condensed? Those two were condensed because of the establishment of the underworld. Now, we only need to truly unify the world of the Yang and let the structure of the entire world of the Yang truly fuse into one. Then, the treasures will definitely be formed. Right now, the entire world is actually mostly unified. All that's left is the last step. As long as we complete this step, it will be enough for the world to condense the treasures. The Realm King said, these supreme sovereigns were all the most intelligent existences in the world. Although the Realm King's explanation wasn't too clear, he had already stated the key points. It was enough for them to understand and understand everything. At that moment, the supreme ruler's eyes shone with a joyful light. One by one, they nodded in agreement with the Realm King's words. Seeing that many sovereigns agreed with his suggestion, the Realm King turned to Luo Fan with a smile and asked, "Fellow Taoist method, is it similar?" Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "That's right." Hearing this, the Realm King's originally slightly tense expression finally relaxed completely. Luo Fan, whose strength and knowledge weren't inferior to his, also thought the same. Naturally, he was more confident in his own idea. Since they had reached a consensus, the next step was naturally to take action. Immediately, the many sovereigns split into billions of clones and headed to different parts of the world. Almost in the blink of an eye, they had already dispersed to every region of the world.